For almost 3 billion years, Earth was alive, but almost nothing on it looked alive in the way we understand life today. No forests, no fish, no predators, no footsteps in the mud, just a strange, silent world ruled by microbes too small to see. And then, after an almost unimaginable wait, something changed. Animal life burst onto the scene and transformed the planet forever. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of mystery and deep time history you enjoy, the world is alive, but almost nothing about it changes in the way change is usually imagined. There are no forests, no wings, no jaws, no eyes lifting toward a sunlit horizon. No creature hunts, no creature flees, no animal leaves tracks in wet sediment because there are no animals yet to leave them. The continents are barren slabs of rock under a dimmer young sun. The oceans move under strange skies. Volcanoes breathe into the air. Lightning breaks across clouds that drift over a planet already inhabited, and yet inhabited in a way almost impossible to picture. Because for an immense span of time, Earth belongs to life that remains microscopic, patient, and stubbornly simple. For nearly 3 billion years, the story of life seems to advance without producing the kinds of bodies most people instinctively associate with evolution. It is a living world, but not a dramatic one, at least not on the surface. That is the first unsettling fact. Life appears on Earth astonishingly early. The planet itself forms around 4.5 billion years ago. The oldest persuasive traces of life emerge not long after, in geological terms almost immediately, once the surface cools enough and the first stable oceans persist. And yet after this opening act, after the almost miraculous leap from chemistry to biology, the script seems to stall. The record stretches onward through time so vast it resists intuition. Continents drift, oceans open and close, the atmosphere transforms, ice advances and retreats, mountains rise and erode into dust, the sun grows brighter overhead, and through all of it, life remains overwhelmingly microbial. A few major innovations appear, then linger without an obvious revolution following behind them. It is as though evolution reaches a threshold, crosses it, and then waits in darkness for an unimaginably long time. This is where the mystery begins, not with a sudden explosion of creatures, but with the silence before it. Why does life arrive early, survive catastrophes, reshape the chemistry of the entire planet, and still refrain from becoming what later seems almost inevitable, looking backward from the modern world? With its crowded surfaces and layered ecosystems, it is tempting to imagine that once life begins, complexity simply marches forward. But Earth does not behave that way. For most of its history, it is not a planet of visible abundance. It is a microbial planet. It is a world where the winners are tiny, ancient, and astonishingly efficient. They coat sediments in films. They build layered mats in shallow seas. They drift, divide, ferment, photosynthesize, and endure. They fill every available niche without ever needing to become large. From their perspective, perhaps nothing is missing at all. That is one of the hardest ideas to hold on to. Evolution is not a ladder climbing toward animals, much less toward humans. It has no built-in preference for intelligence, for size, for beauty, or for complexity in the familiar sense. Natural selection favors what works, and for billions of years what works is the microbial way of life. A bacterium does not need a nervous system. It does not need a skeleton or a digestive tract or a circulatory network. It does not need to invent the eye. It survives by being chemically intimate with its environment, by exchanging genes, by reproducing fast, by spreading into niches where larger life could never function. In terms of sheer success, microbes are not primitive failures waiting to be surpassed. They are among the greatest survivors the planet has ever produced. And yet something about that answer feels incomplete. Because even if complexity is not inevitable, it does eventually arrive. Somewhere far ahead in this deep stretch of time, bodies will become multicellular, cells will specialize, tissues will coordinate, nervous systems will emerge, and the seafloor will fill with moving, sensing, feeding organisms. Predators will evolve, prey will respond, skeletons will harden, eyes will sharpen within a comparatively brief interval. The world will look startlingly different. The question is not only why life remains simple for so long, but what finally breaks the long equilibrium. What changes in the planet, in cells, in energy, in ecology, or in chance itself that allows a microbial Earth to become an animal Earth. To appreciate how strange this delay is, it helps to scale it properly. If Earth's history were compressed into a single day, life would appear very early in the pre-dawn hours. But for most of the day, nothing like an animal would exist. The oceans would already contain living things for hour after hour after hour, while the world remained empty of fish, empty of trees, empty of insects, empty of any voice or footstep or bone. Complex life would not arrive until late in the evening, and humans would emerge only in the final moments before midnight. That familiar image is used often because it is effective, but it also carries a deeper lesson. The overwhelming majority of life's history is not the story of large organisms, it is the story of cells. Everything that comes later rests on that long, patient foundation. The early Earth itself does not make the mystery easier. It is not merely a younger version of the planet now. Its atmosphere contains little or no free oxygen at first. Its oceans are chemically different, rich in dissolved iron and shaped by volcanic inputs that no longer dominate in the same way. The moon hangs closer, days are shorter, ultraviolet radiation falls more harshly through an atmosphere lacking the modern ozone shield. Continents may be smaller or differently arranged. Beneath the surface, the interior of the planet runs hotter. Even the colour of the seas and skies may not match the world that later animals inherit. This is an alien Earth, though not alien in the sense of being dead. It is alive in strange ways, and the life it supports is adapted to conditions that would be hostile to many modern organisms. In such a setting, simplicity may not be a failure to innovate but a profound fit with circumstance. Small cells exchange chemicals easily with the world around them. They thrive in extreme heat, in acidic pools, in dark ocean sediments, in sunlit shallows, in hydrothermal systems, in places starved of oxygen, and in places intermittently flooded with light. They are flexible. They can live as individuals or in communities, cooperating loosely without committing to the costly architecture of a true body. Larger, more complex organisms require more than time. They require reliable energy flows, stable environments in some respects and changing ones in others, and cellular systems capable of coordination without collapse. They require a planet that can support not just life, but a certain kind of life. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the mystery deepens when the planet itself begins to change under microbial influence. Life does not merely endure on Earth, it alters Earth. The smallest organisms start modifying the atmosphere, the chemistry of the oceans, and the cycling of crucial elements. In one sense, the planet is quiet. In another, it is being transformed by invisible labour on a scale beyond imagination. Layer by layer, over spans longer than mountain ranges usually survive. These microbes help build conditions for futures they will never witness in any conscious sense. The irony is almost impossible to miss. For billions of years, the most important events on Earth are carried out by beings too small to see. The rocks preserve fragments of this deep past, but only fragments. Almost everything alive in those earliest ages is soft, microscopic, and easily erased. Entire biospheres can vanish without leaving anything that resembles a conventional fossil. What remains instead are chemical fingerprints, isotopic ratios, stromatolite structures built by microbial communities, microscopic textures, mineral patterns, and broad atmospheric signals written into stone. Scholars still debate some of the earliest evidence. The record is ancient, altered, and incomplete. Some rocks have been buried, heated, squeezed, and recrystallized so many times that the original story has to be reconstructed through layers of damage. No single outcrop delivers a clear beginning. What survives in the record suggests life emerges early and persists stubbornly, but the details remain blurred by the violence of time. That uncertainty matters because it keeps the opening of life's story from becoming too neat. There is no single perfect moment when the curtain rises and Earth suddenly becomes biological. Instead, there are hints, probabilities, contested traces, and gradually strengthening signs. By around 3.5 billion years ago, the evidence becomes much firmer. Microbial communities are present, metabolizing, building structures, interacting with sediments and water. The world is unmistakably alive. But even then, the leap from chemistry to cells, from cells to ecosystems, from ecosystems to complexity, remains obscured by distance. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the atmosphere of this entire story. The deep past does not give up its secrets cleanly. Still, the broad outline is clear enough to be astonishing. Life begins early. It persists through conditions that seem brutal. It spreads across the planet. It innovates metabolically. It changes the air. And then, for a duration so vast it dwarfs all later human history into nothing. It does not produce the dramatic anatomical pageant that comes to define popular imagination. No trilobites yet. No reefs of coral as they are later known. No fish in armoured swarms. No ferns. No dinosaurs. Not even worms tunnelling through marine mud. There is life almost everywhere, but it is life on another scale. Seen from the future, this long stillness can feel eerie, as though the world is holding its breath. But perhaps that is only hindsight speaking. To the organisms of the time, there is no stillness. There is competition, adaptation, chemical warfare, cooperation, extinction, survival, and continual evolution within microscopic realms. Genes change, metabolisms diversify, ecologies form and collapse. The microbial world is not static at all. It is dynamic in ways that do not register as spectacle to eyes that do not yet exist. The great mistake is to confuse invisibility with inactivity. For nearly 3 billion years, Earth is not waiting for evolution to start. Evolution is already everywhere. It is only happening mostly below the threshold of ordinary imagination. And yet sooner or later the threshold will be crossed. The quiet chemical world of cells will give rise to bodies. Invisible communities will help build oxygen-rich air. Ancient oceans will become arenas for new experiments. Cells will merge, specialize, and cooperate more intimately than before. Climate crises will repeatedly threaten the biosphere and perhaps force innovation. Strange organisms will appear that seem to belong to no familiar category. Then, eventually, animals will enter the scene and alter the planet so thoroughly that the earlier microbial age will come to feel like a prologue, even though it is in fact the main body of Earth's story. That reversal is worth lingering over. The age of animals feels central only because humans are animals, and because human attention is drawn to what it can see. But for most of Earth's existence, the rulers of the planet are not large, intelligent, or visible. They are microscopic. They are ancestral. They are chemically ingenious. They inherit a harsh young world and slowly, almost imperceptibly, make another world possible. The great explosion of animal life, when it finally comes, is real. It is one of the most consequential transitions in the history of this planet, but it rises out of an older and stranger empire, a world so deep in time that it almost disappears from intuition altogether. To understand why animals appear when they do, and why they do not appear sooner, the story has to begin there, in those ancient seas where the first living traces take hold, faint and fragile, in a world that has only just become habitable. The earliest chapter does not begin with bones or shells or even with anything that resembles a fossil in the ordinary sense. It begins with stains in stone, with carbon behaving in a way that seems to hint at biology, with layered structures in ancient shallow waters, with textures and chemistry that suggest something on the young Earth is already eating, growing, dividing, and leaving traces behind. The trouble is that the deeper one looks into time, the more the rocks themselves become unreliable witnesses. They have been cooked, bent, fractured, and remade. Entire crustal sections from Earth's infancy are gone, recycled into the mantle or worn away. What survives is rare and often damaged. That is why the first living traces arrive not as a dramatic revelation, but as an argument spread over decades, a collection of clues that slowly becomes harder to dismiss. By about 3.5 billion years ago, the evidence for life is strong enough that most researchers are comfortable saying the planet is already inhabited. In Western Australia and South Africa, some of the oldest well-known rock formations preserve structures called stromatolites, layered domes or columns built as microbial communities trap sediment or induce minerals to precipitate around them. They are not individual organisms but communal architectures, the kind of thing that can persist in shallow water where mats of microbes grow, layer after layer, over long periods. Modern stromatolites still exist in a few unusual places, and they offer a suggestive living analogy, though not a perfect one. These ancient structures are important because they imply not only life, but organized microbial ecosystems capable of reshaping their immediate environment. Already, life is not merely surviving, it is engineering surfaces. Even earlier hints remain more controversial. Some carbon isotopic signatures in very old rocks have been interpreted as signs of biological activity, because living systems tend to favor lighter carbon isotopes in ways that can leave a measurable imbalance behind. There are also claims about microscopic filaments or cell-like shapes preserved in ancient deposits. But morphology alone can be deceiving. Non-living processes sometimes create forms that look uncannily biological, especially when viewed through the haze of expectation. Scholars still debate which traces truly record early life and which may reflect later contamination or purely geological effects. The evidence remains incomplete, and this uncertainty has shaped the field for decades. Few areas of science are as vulnerable to wishful interpretation as the search for first life in rocks older than most mountain ranges on Earth. Yet even allowing for caution, the broader picture remains striking. Life seems to emerge relatively early after the planet becomes stable enough to support long-lived oceans. That alone carries extraordinary implications. The early Earth is not gentle. In its first several 100 million years, it endures heavy bombardment from leftover planetary debris. Its surface is repeatedly scarred by impacts. Its crust is unstable. Heat flow from the interior is stronger. Volcanoes are common. The atmosphere is unlike the modern one and offers little protection from ultraviolet radiation. And still, sometime amid these harsh conditions, chemistry crosses into biology. Whether life originates in shallow pools, hydrothermal settings, or through multiple environments interacting over time, no consensus fully settles the question. But once it appears, it proves astonishingly difficult to erase. This resilience becomes one of the defining features of the story. Early life is small, but it is not fragile in the usual sense. Microbial organisms survive extremes of temperature, acidity, salinity, pressure, and chemical stress that would kill most complex organisms quickly. Some live by sunlight. Others live by exploiting chemical gradients near vents or within rocks. Some tolerate oxygen poorly. Others will later help fill the planet with it. Their metabolisms are varied in ways that make later animal ecosystems look almost conservative by comparison. Long before eyes or limbs or nervous systems, life is already conducting a sprawling chemical experiment across the Earth. At first, the atmosphere contains very little free oxygen. That matters because oxygen, for all its later importance, is dangerous chemistry. It is highly reactive. To many early organisms it would have been not a gift but a toxin. The young biosphere is built largely by anaerobic life, organisms that do not require oxygen and in many cases cannot tolerate much of it. Their world runs on fermentation, methanogenesis, sulfur cycling, and other metabolic strategies that fit the chemistry of ancient oceans and skies. If one tries to imagine this Earth visually, it is not the blue-green planet of the familiar imagination. The oceans may often carry dissolved iron in abundance, perhaps giving some waters a greenish cast. The air is hazy with volcanic gases and methane. Coastlines are dark and bare. Life hugs wet surfaces, shallow marine shelves, sediments, and chemically active zones where energy can be harvested one molecular transfer at a time. And yet among these ancient metabolisms, one innovation quietly changes everything: photosynthesis. Not all photosynthesis is the same, and some early forms do not produce oxygen. But eventually a lineage of microbes, ancestors of what are now called cyanobacteria, evolves oxygenic photosynthesis, using sunlight to split water and release oxygen as a byproduct. It is difficult to overstate the significance of that development from the perspective of the microbes performing it. This may simply be an effective way to capture energy. From the perspective of the planet, it is a revolution waiting to unfold. Sunlight is plentiful, water is abundant. Once a metabolism can tap into both at scale, its influence can become geologic. But the transformation is not immediate. Oxygen released into the environment does not instantly accumulate in the atmosphere. For a long time it is absorbed by reduced materials, especially iron dissolved in the oceans and reactive volcanic gases. Ancient seas become the stage for one of the most dramatic invisible shifts in planetary history. As oxygen reacts with iron, it helps form iron oxides that settle out and build the great banded iron formations found in rocks of the Precambrian. These layers, alternating between iron-rich minerals and silica, are among the clearest records that the chemistry of Earth is changing profoundly. The process is slow on a human scale and immense on a geological one. Microbes in sunlit waters are altering the composition of oceans thousands of kilometers wide. This is the paradox of the first living traces. They are tiny in form but planetary in consequence. A microbial mat only millimeters thick can participate in cycles that eventually transform atmosphere, ocean, and climate. A colony of cells with no nervous system, no intention, and no awareness can leave a mark that survives for billions of years in stone. The ancient world is full of such disproportions. It is a place where the smallest actors alter the largest systems. That is why the early biosphere matters so much. It does not look spectacular, but it sets the terms for everything later. What makes these first traces so haunting is that they reveal a world already occupied by life for an unimaginably long time before anything familiar appears. By the time the first clear stromatolites are built, life has likely already diversified in microbial ways that the fossil record captures only poorly. Genes are being exchanged, ecologies are forming around gradients of light, temperature, and chemistry. Mats grow in tidal flats and lagoons. Microbes colonize volcanic surfaces, sediments, perhaps even the pores of rocks deep below ground. Some lineages disappear without obvious descendants, others endure so long that their distant relatives are still present in the modern world. What survives in the record suggests a biosphere both ancient and inventive, though much of that invention happens at scales no eye can see. It is also here that one has to abandon the comforting idea that early life is simple in every sense. Structurally, yes, these are cells without the elaborate bodies of later organisms, but metabolically and ecologically they are sophisticated. They manage energy under constraints that would seem impossible to larger life. They form biofilms and communities that buffer external stress. They alter local pH, trap sediment, precipitate minerals, and cooperate in layered systems where different microbial species occupy different chemical microzones only millimeters apart. In a single mat, the upper layer may be rich in photosynthetic activity by day, while deeper layers run on sulfur metabolism or other anaerobic processes. It is a city without visible architecture, a living skin stretched across mud and stone. The less familiar detail, often overlooked in broad tellings of evolution, is how dominant these systems remain for so long, not merely because nothing better evolves, but because they are extremely good at what they do. A world ruled by microbes is not a half-finished draft. It is a stable mode of planetary life. The sea floor can be covered in microbial carpets. Shallow marine environments can host vast expanses of stromatolite building communities. Nutrients cycle, gases exchange. Organic matter is produced and consumed, and the biosphere persists without any need for larger bodies. In fact, later animal activity will damage some of these microbial dominions by burrowing, grazing, and disturbing sediments. From the standpoint of the Precambrian microbial world, animals will eventually become disruptive newcomers. That perspective changes the emotional shape of the story. Instead of imagining billions of years as empty waiting time, it becomes possible to see them as the age of the first great empire of life. It is an empire without rulers, monuments, or memory, but it is astonishingly durable. It survives meteor impacts, volcanic upheavals, changing seas, and continental rearrangements. It spreads across a world that is still geologically restless, and it does more than survive. It modifies the very conditions under which future evolution will operate. The first living traces are therefore not marginal curiosities near the beginning of the timeline. They are the opening infrastructure of the entire biological planet. Still, There is tension building beneath this long dominance. Oxygenic photosynthesis, once established, cannot remain a local curiosity forever. Even if oxygen is initially mopped up by iron and other sinks, the balance will eventually shift. The oceans cannot absorb reactive change endlessly. The atmosphere cannot remain chemically untouched forever. A metabolism invented by microbes in ancient seas is about to force the whole Earth into a new state. And when that happens, the first great age of a life will reveal something unsettling about evolution. The organisms that transform the planet are not necessarily the ones best suited to the transformed planet. For now, though, the world remains overwhelmingly microbial. Its first traces are faint but persistent, written in layered stone, chemical biases, and textures that survive where bodies do not. They tell of a biosphere already old, already busy, already capable of changing the planet. They also tell of a strange patience. Life has arrived, it has spread, it has begun rewriting Earth. But the forms that later fill the seas and eventually crawl onto land are still unimaginably far away. The stage is being built long before the familiar actors appear, and almost all of that construction is carried out by beings too small to cast a shadow. For a span of time so large that all recorded human history would vanish inside it without leaving a mark. The Earth belongs to microbes, not in the casual sense that they are present somewhere in the background, but in the stronger sense that they define the living character of the planet. They occupy the shorelines, the shallow seas, the sediments below them, the waters above them, the rocks beneath the surface, perhaps even deep habitats cut off from sunlight entirely. They do not merely survive in scattered refuges. They build the world's first durable ecosystems. If the early traces of life are faint, the age that follows is not faint at all in its consequences. It is an age of microbial empire, though empire here must be understood without kings, armies, or ambition. It is domination by persistence, by chemistry, by numbers beyond counting. The shallow marine shelf is one of their great strongholds. Sunlight pours into coastal waters, sediments drift and settle, tides advance and withdraw. In these shifting margins, microbial mats spread across mudflats and submerged surfaces like living fabric. Their upper layers capture light, their lower layers operate in darker chemistry, processing sulfur, carbon, and other elements through microscopic exchanges that form tightly integrated communities. What looks from a distance like a flat film can in reality contain steep chemical gradients and distinct ecological zones only fractions of a millimeter apart. These are layered worlds built on a scale that defeats ordinary perception. A footstep, if feet existed, would erase cities. In some places, these communities trap fine grains and help bind them into structures that accumulate over time. Stromatolites rise in domes, columns, and knobby mounds from the seafloor, not through intention, but through repetition. Day after day, generation after generation. Mats grow upward toward light as sediment settles over them. Minerals precipitate. New layers form. The result is a fossilized record of communal living. Architecture made by organisms that possess no blueprint and no central coordination. Some Precambrian coastlines may have been edged by fields of these structures, rising from warm shallows under a sky unlike any now seen on Earth. They are among the closest things that ancient microbial life leaves behind to monuments. Yet their success is not confined to sunlit waters. Microbial life spreads into environments that seem incompatible with flourishing. In volcanic systems and hydrothermal settings, organisms exploit chemical disequilibria that have nothing to do with daylight. In sediments cut off from oxygen, Other lineages process sulfur compounds, iron, methane, or hydrogen. Life becomes metabolically versatile in ways that later animals never fully match. Animals will eventually dominate what is visible. Microbes already dominate what is possible. They can endure starvation, heat, brine, acidity, freezing, burial, and darkness. Many can become dormant or shift strategies when conditions change. Entire habitats exist that only make sense if life is thought of not as bodies moving through space, but as chemistry exploiting every usable gradient. This matters because it changes the usual emotional scale of the Precambrian. It is often imagined as dull simply because it lacks large organisms, but dullness is a problem of human attention, not of biology. In a microbial world, competition can be ferocious. Communities expand and collapse. Nutrients become scarce and are fought over molecule by molecule. Some microbes release compounds that inhibit rivals. Others adapt to toxins that kill less flexible neighbors. Horizontal gene transfer allows useful traits to move across lineages in ways that make later evolutionary stories seem almost formal by comparison. The microbial age is not static. It is experimental, opportunistic, and relentless. It just hides its drama below the threshold of ordinary sight. The sea floor during this long era is also a different kind of landscape from the one animals later inherit. Without burrowing worms, crustaceans, mollusks, or fish to churn the sediment, the upper layers of the seabed remain largely undisturbed. Microbial mats can spread across broad surfaces and remain intact. Fine laminations persist. Chemical boundaries stay sharply defined. Later, once animals begin crawling, probing, and feeding through the sediment, much of this ancient order will be broken up. Bioturbation, the churning of sediment by living creatures, will become one of the great ecological revolutions of Earth history. But for now, the seafloor is quieter, more stable in texture, and more accessible to these layered microbial systems. The world is built for mats. There is a strange grandeur to this. The oceans are not empty waiting rooms for future complexity. They are full, but full in another way. They hold drifting planktonic microbes, bottom-bound communities, chemically specialized colonies around vents, and perhaps extensive subseafloor biospheres hidden within rock pores and fractures. Organic matter is produced and consumed. Nutrients cycle. Gases move between life and environment over immense time. The cumulative effect of these activities becomes planetary. Carbon is drawn down and released. Sulfur cycles through different forms. Methane enters the air and influences climate. Oxygen begins, unevenly, and at first almost reluctantly, to appear where certain microbes are active. A world ruled by small cells can still have global weather, global chemistry, and global ecological consequences. What makes the Empire especially difficult to imagine is that it lasts not for a few symbolic eons, but for most of Earth's biological history. Generation follows generation so many times that numbers lose meaning. Coastlines shift across continents that no longer exist. Supercontinents assemble and break apart. The sun slowly brightens overhead even as life helps regulate the planet's surface conditions. Through all of this, microbes remain the central actors. If a traveller from the far future could stand on a Precambrian shoreline, the scene might seem almost lifeless at first glance. Bare rock, shallow water, strange layered mounds in tidal flats, perhaps filmy surfaces gleaming in sunlight, no plants, no birds, no sound except surf and wind. But that apparent emptiness would be deceptive. Almost every wet surface would host living communities. the silence would hide abundance. There is also a subtle but important shift occurring within this long-age microbial communities are not just shaping the environment, they are shaping one another. Once photosynthetic organisms begin producing organic matter at scale, they create opportunities for other organisms to consume it. Once oxygen appears locally, even in limited amounts, it creates both danger and possibility. Toxicity for some lineages becomes opportunity for others. New metabolisms evolve to detoxify reactive oxygen species or exploit oxygen directly where it is available. Ecological complexity begins long before large bodies do. Predation in the later animal sense does not yet dominate, but biochemical dependency, competition, and cooperation weave increasingly intricate networks through the invisible biosphere. A lesser-known detail in this story is how much of the modern world still belongs to that empire. Even now, long after animals transform land and sea, microbes remain the majority in many measures that matter most. They dominate biomass in some hidden environments, control major biogeochemical cycles, inhabit extreme niches, and live within the bodies of larger organisms, including humans. The ancient empire never ends. It is only joined, layered over, and partly obscured by later forms of life. This makes the Precambrian less like a discarded first draft and more like a foundation that never stops supporting the structure built above it. Still, foundations can create constraints as well as opportunities. The microbial world is efficient, but it may also be difficult to escape. Single cells exchange materials easily with their surroundings because they are small. Their geometry works in their favor. As cells become larger, the surface area available for exchange no longer keeps pace with internal volume. That imposes energetic and transport limitations. To overcome them, life will eventually need innovations that are not trivial. Internal compartmentalization, cytoskeletal support, coordinated gene regulation, controlled communication between cells, and energy production efficient enough to support more elaborate structures. For a very long time, those thresholds are not crossed in a way that remakes the visible world. Whether this reflects bad luck, biochemical difficulty, environmental instability, or some combination of all three is still debated. No single explanation fully accounts for the delay. Meanwhile, the microbial empire prospers without needing any of it. Its success can even make later development seem unnecessary. Why evolve a body if a film of cells on sediment already captures light and nutrients efficiently? Why build tissues if free-living or loosely colonial life is enough? Evolution does not plan ahead. It favors immediate advantage. In that sense, the Earth of this era is full of solutions that work so well, they may reduce the pressure for more elaborate ones. Complexity is expensive. It requires coordination. It creates new ways to fail. A multicellular organism can starve because one system breaks down. A microbe dividing in a favorable environment does not need to solve those problems at all. And yet the empire is not perfectly stable. Within it lie tensions that will matter later. Oxygenic photosynthesis continues. Continental weathering changes the supply of nutrients to oceans. Tectonic cycles rearrange land and sea, altering coastlines and shallow marine habitats where microbial productivity is high. Volcanic activity shifts atmospheric chemistry. The sun brightens gradually through deep time, changing the energy budget of the planet. Microbial evolution itself keeps generating novelty, including lineages capable of inhabiting newly altered conditions. Even in an age of apparent sameness, the underlying system is moving. The changes are slow, non-linear, and sometimes hidden, but they accumulate. This makes the long microbial age feel less like a stall and more like pressure building behind stone. The visible world remains nearly empty of large organisms, but the invisible world is rewriting the terms of life. It is storing oxygen in rocks, releasing gases into the atmosphere, innovating metabolisms, shaping sediments, and maintaining biospheres through conditions that would repeatedly test any future animal lineage. It is also leaving behind clues of enormous subtlety, isotopic patterns, redox signals in ancient shales, laminated structures in carbonates, mineral deposits that record the chemistry of vanished seas. The Empire writes in chemistry because it has almost no other medium. Scholars still debate how uniform this world really is across the billions of years it spans. The Precambrian is so immense that compressing it into a single microbial age can hide important changes. Different intervals likely see different climates, ocean chemistry, continental arrangements, and evolutionary experiments. Some microbial ecosystems expand while others contract. Some metabolisms become globally important only after long local beginnings. The evidence is patchy enough that sweeping simplicity is dangerous. What survives in the record suggests continuity, but it also hints at complexity and turnover within that continuity. Even an empire this durable has internal history. What it does not yet have is anything recognizably animal. No mouth opens, no muscle contracts in coordinated pursuit, no eye forms to turn sunlight into image. The world can be greened chemically without being green visually. It can be alive in every ocean basin while remaining eerily empty to a future observer trained to look for motion and form. That eerie emptiness is one reason the next transformation will feel so dramatic when it arrives. Animals do not step into a dead world. They step into an ancient one, already occupied, already shaped, already regulated by life immeasurably older than themselves. And the force that will begin to destabilize this ancient order further is already present in microbial hands. It drifts through shallow waters and spreads across illuminated surfaces. It works silently, powered by sunlight. It releases a waste product that most of Earth has never known in abundance. In time, that waste will poison vast parts of the old biosphere, rust the oceans, and alter the air. The microbial empire has built the first global world of life. Now it is about to trigger the first great planetary crisis of life's own making. The catastrophe begins as a side effect. No asteroid has to strike. No supervolcano has to bury continents in ash. No sudden fracture needs to open beneath the sea. Instead, some of the smallest organisms on Earth begin using sunlight in a way that changes the chemistry of the entire planet. And in doing so, they set off one of the most consequential upheavals in the history of life. Oxygen, which to later animals will seem so ordinary as to be almost invisible, enters the story first as a disruptive force. It is not welcomed by the existing world. It arrives like a pollutant. For countless generations, the products of oxygenic photosynthesis do not gather freely in the air. The oxygen released by cyanobacteria and their relatives is quickly consumed by chemical sinks all around them. It reacts with dissolved iron in seawater. It reacts with reduced volcanic gases. It reacts with exposed minerals at the surface. The ancient oceans, rich in iron, become a vast reservoir for this new chemistry. As oxygen encounters that dissolved iron, it helps turn it into insoluble oxides that fall out of solution and settle onto the seafloor. Over immense spans of time, this process contributes to the formation of banded iron deposits, those remarkable layered rocks that preserve one of the clearest signatures of a planet in transition. The sea, in effect, begins to rust. It is difficult to imagine the scale of this because the process is so gradual and yet so global. In modern experience, a rusting nail or a weathered surface suggest decay at the level of objects. Here the object is the ocean itself. Whole marine basins participate in a chemical transformation driven by microscopic photosynthesizers in shallow waters. The ancient world is still one where life is invisible to casual sight, but its consequences are no longer confined to local habitats. The Earth has entered an age in which biology begins dictating the terms of geochemistry on a planetary scale. At first, this buffering effect delays what will later seem inevitable. So long as there is enough reduced material to absorb the oxygen, the atmosphere remains relatively poor in it. But no sink lasts forever. Over time, as more iron is oxidized and more reactive gases are neutralized, oxygen begins to persist in surface environments for longer intervals and in greater concentrations. What had once vanished into chemical reactions now starts accumulating. The transition is not simple, not perfectly monotonic, and not uniform across the whole planet. Local oxygen oases may appear before the atmosphere changes globally. Some environments become more oxidizing while others remain stubbornly anoxic. Scholars still debate the exact timing and shape of the rise, because the evidence comes from multiple proxies, and the deep record is notoriously difficult to read cleanly. But the broad fact is clear enough. The world is changing in a way that many of its inhabitants cannot survive unchanged. This event is often called the Great Oxidation Event, though the phrase can make it sound sudden, almost instantaneous. In geological terms, it is dramatic. In human terms, it is unimaginably slow. Yet slowness does not soften its significance. For anaerobic organisms adapted to a low-oxygen world, free oxygen is chemically dangerous. It damages cellular machinery, generates reactive forms that tear through biological molecules, and creates conditions many established lineages are poorly equipped to endure. Entire ecological arrangements built over vast stretches of time come under stress. Some organisms retreat into oxygen-poor refuges such as deep sediments, stagnant waters, or subterranean environments. Others adapt, evolve protective mechanisms, or learn to exploit oxygen where it appears. Many vanish from prominence. Life's first global pollution crisis is also one of its first great sorting events. There is an irony here so sharp it almost feels literary. The organisms causing this crisis are not malicious conquerors. They are simply successful. They find an abundant energy source, sunlight, and a plentiful electron donor, water, and they begin metabolizing at scales that no existing planetary system can indefinitely absorb. Their waste product accumulates until the world itself is pushed into a different state. Evolution does not intend consequences. It only amplifies useful strategies. Yet the result is an environmental transformation so profound that it redraws the boundaries of habitability. In that sense, the great oxygen upheaval is not just a change in atmosphere. It is the first time life remakes the rules under which life must continue. The consequences do not stop at toxicity. Oxygen also helps reshape climate. Before its rise, methane likely plays a major role in warming the early Earth, compensating for a sun that, though brightening over time, is still dimmer than it is today. In an atmosphere rich in methane, greenhouse warming can be significant, but oxygen undermines methane's persistence, reacting through atmospheric chemistry that reduces its abundance. If methane falls, warming weakens. Some researchers have linked the rise of oxygen to climatic cooling on a large scale, perhaps even to episodes of severe glaciation. The evidence for exact causal chains remains debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for every feature of the ancient climate record. But what survives in the record suggests that atmospheric change and climate instability are closely entangled. The air does not change alone. So this microbial innovation, which begins in shallow waters under sunlight, may help trigger a cascade affecting sea chemistry, rock formation, atmospheric composition, and global temperature. It is one of the clearest demonstrations in Earth history that life is not merely subject to planetary systems. Life can become a planetary system. The biosphere is no passive passenger. It is an engine of transformation. Still, the oxygen revolution does not immediately produce animals or even anything close to them. That is another reason this part of the story matters. It is tempting to treat oxygen as the magic key that unlocks complexity. And in a limited sense, oxygen does later support high-energy metabolisms crucial for larger bodies. But the timeline warns against easy conclusions. Oxygen rises, at least in some sustained form, long before animals appear. There remains an enormous gap. The atmospheric change is essential in the long run, perhaps even foundational, yet by itself it is not enough. The deep mystery only shifts shape. Instead of asking why complexity fails to emerge in a low-oxygen world, one must now ask why it still fails to emerge, or emerges only in limited ways, after the chemistry of the planet has already been so radically transformed. Part of the answer may lie in how uneven and unstable oxygenation remains. The atmosphere can become more oxygen-rich while much of the deep ocean remains poorly oxygenated for extended intervals. Surface waters may support one kind of chemistry, while deeper basins hold another. Nutrient cycles respond. Metal availability changes. Some trace elements become more or less accessible to life depending on redox conditions. In other words, oxygen does not simply rise like a uniform tide bathing the whole world at once. It enters a complex planet with layered environments and produces a patchwork of opportunity and stress. Some habitats become newly favorable, others become newly hostile. The biosphere reorganizes, but not into the familiar shape of later ecosystems. Meanwhile, some of the old world survives by going where the new chemistry cannot easily follow. Anaerobic microorganisms do not disappear entirely. They retreat into sediments, deep waters, subsurface rocks, hydrothermal systems, and other low-oxygen refuges. Even today, such organisms still inhabit many hidden environments. Reminders that the pre-oxygen biosphere is not exterminated so much as displaced. That continuity matters. The ancient microbial Earth is not replaced in a clean handover. It remains layered inside the modern one, still living in pockets where older chemical conditions persist. The Great Oxidation event is therefore both a revolution and a compromise. It alters the dominant chemistry of the surface world, while leaving buried realms where ancient styles of life continue almost like memories sealed underground. A lesser-known consequence of oxygen's rise is how it changes the surface in another crucial way. It contributes, indirectly, to the formation of the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere. Ozone, derived from oxygen, helps block harmful ultraviolet radiation. On the young Earth, without a substantial ozone shield, UV radiation at the surface is harsher, especially in exposed terrestrial settings. Once oxygen accumulates enough to support ozone formation, surface conditions become less punishing in certain respects. That does not mean land is suddenly ready for complex life, far from it. But it does mean that one of the planet's basic protective systems is emerging. Another slow preparation for futures still unimaginably distant. Even so, from the perspective of the long narrative, this era still feels more like upheaval than arrival. The seas are chemically transformed. Iron-rich waters yield different mineral signatures than before. The atmosphere is moving away from its ancient state. Some lineages thrive, some retreat, some are erased. Yet if one stood again on a shoreline after the oxygen revolution had run much of its course, the world might still appear, to human eyes, desolately simple. No forest breaks the horizon, no animal patrols the shallows. The great change is real, but it remains largely invisible except through its consequences. The world has been remade at the molecular level before it is remade at the anatomical one. That is one of the deepest patterns in this story. Before bodies become elaborate, environments become elaborate. Before animals transform ecosystems, microbes and geochemistry transform the planet into a place where such ecosystems can eventually exist. The visible drama comes late. The invisible preparation takes almost everything that comes before it. And yet oxygen's rise is not only preparation, it is also disruption severe enough to count among the greatest crises in life's history. There may have been no single day when the sky looked different enough for an observer to mark the change, but over geological spans the transformation is no less consequential than the later mass extinctions that killed dinosaurs or erased trilobites. Here, too, a world ends. The ancient dominion of strictly anaerobic surface life loses its monopoly. A new chemical order begins, one that will eventually support more energetic metabolisms, more elaborate cells, and much later the bodies of animals. But it begins in conflict, with rusting oceans and poisoned niches, with old winners driven into refuge by the success of new ones. No single explanation fully accounts for all the pace and complexity of this transition. Researchers continue to argue over timing, magnitude, feedback loops, and the degree to which oxygen fluctuates rather than simply rises. Some evidence suggests temporary oxygenation followed by reversals. Some intervals may see more dynamic instability than older models allowed. The picture is not static, and the debate itself is part of the reason this deep past remains so compelling. The rocks do not tell a simple story. They tell of a planet lurching toward a new equilibrium through chemistry, climate, and biological innovation. What they do not yet tell is the arrival of larger, complex life. Oxygen changes the world, but complexity still hesitates. The microbial empire has engineered a revolution, and yet after the upheaval settles, Earth still does not fill with animals. The atmosphere is no longer what it was. The seas are no longer what they were. The rules have changed, but the great anatomical burst remains far in the future. Something else is missing, some combination of energetic capacity, cellular machinery, ecological pressure, and environmental stability that oxygen alone cannot provide. So the oxygen catastrophe, for all its grandeur, leaves behind a new puzzle. If the planet now holds one of the ingredients later animals will plainly require, why does the long silence continue? Why does complexity still seem stalled in the aftermath of such a transformation? The answer lies not only in the air above the oceans, but in the hidden limitations of cells themselves, and in a world that remains, despite everything, far more difficult for complex bodies than it might first appear. Oxygen changes the planet, but it does not immediately solve the deeper problem of complexity. That is the tension now hanging over the story. The air is no longer entirely alien to later life. Surface environments begin, at least intermittently and unevenly, to hold a resource that eventually supports powerful metabolisms. The oceans have already recorded one immense chemical revolution, and yet the Earth still does not erupt into visible abundance. It remains, for an immense span afterward, largely a microbial world. If oxygen were the whole answer, the long delay should already be ending. Instead, the delay continues, and that forces the question into sharper focus. What exactly is stopping life from taking the next step? Part of the answer begins with a simple physical constraint that becomes surprisingly severe when life tries to scale up. Small cells work because their relationship to the environment is intimate. Nutrients diffuse in. Waste diffuses out. Internal distances are short. Chemical reactions do not need elaborate transport systems to connect one region of the cell to another. The geometry of smallness is generous, but as a cell increases in size, that geometry turns against it. Volume grows faster than surface area. Internal organization becomes harder. Energy must travel farther. Molecules have more difficulty reaching where they are needed in time. Information has to be coordinated across a larger internal space. A cell can become more complicated, but only if it finds ways to overcome these costs. For most of life's history, that barrier may have been among the most important invisible limits on evolution. This is one reason why complexity is not simply a matter of waiting longer. Evolution can refine what already works, but certain transitions are hard because they require multiple systems to change together. A larger cell without enough energy is inefficient. A multicellular organism without reliable coordination is not really an organism at all, just a clump. Specialization creates dependence. Dependence creates fragility. Once one part of a larger system relies on another, failure can spread. Microbial life avoids many of these problems by remaining modular and independent. One cell divides into two. A lineage persists through numbers and flexibility rather than through integration. To move beyond that strategy, life needs a new basis for energetic and structural organization. Oxygen helps, but perhaps not in the simple way often imagined. The presence of oxygen can make high-yield respiration possible, allowing cells to extract far more usable energy from food than anaerobic metabolisms usually can. That later matters enormously. But oxygen outside a cell is not enough if the cell lacks the internal machinery to exploit it effectively. Early life may live in a world with rising oxygen and still be unable to turn that oxygen into the kind of stable, scalable energetic surplus required for larger bodies. This is where the mystery shifts inward, from planetary chemistry to cellular architecture. Even before that deeper transition, environmental limits may also hold complexity back. Oxygen itself is not steady everywhere. The oceans remain stratified and often hostile below surface layers. Nutrient availability fluctuates. Trace metals essential to certain biological processes rise and fall with redox conditions. Continents weather at changing rates, affecting phosphorus and other inputs that can stimulate productivity. Some environments may briefly support more elaborate forms of life only to become inhospitable again when chemistry shifts. In that sense, the Earth after the oxygen revolution may still be too unstable, too patchy, or too constrained for complexity to expand confidently. A planet can contain ingredients without yet providing a reliable kitchen. Climate likely adds another obstacle. The Precambrian world is not a calm background against which biology proceeds smoothly. Its atmosphere, oceans, and tectonic rhythms continue to shift over immense spans. Supercontinents assemble and break apart, altering coastlines, ocean circulation, and nutrient delivery. Volcanic activity changes the balance of greenhouse gases. Weathering draws carbon from the atmosphere and sometimes helps cool the world. The sun brightens slowly over time. But that long trend is repeatedly overlaid by shorter-term climatic disruptions. For complex life trying to gain a foothold, this may matter a great deal. Microbes can survive astonishing instability. More integrated organisms, especially in their early experimental stages, may be far more vulnerable to repeated environmental reversals. There is also an ecological problem hidden within the success of microbes themselves. The microbial world is not empty space waiting to be occupied. It is already crowded, efficient, and adapted to nearly every available gradient of light and chemistry. Any new, more complex lineage entering that world would not be stepping into unused opportunity. It would be confronting incumbents that have been optimizing their survival for billions of years. Microbial mats dominate broad surfaces. Free-living cells fill the water column. Anaerobic and aerobic niches alike are already being used. In such a world, complexity has to justify itself. It must do something that microbial life cannot do as effectively. Until new ecological opportunities emerge, or until internal cellular innovations make new strategies possible, larger organization may simply not pay for itself. This helps explain why the fossil record of the long Middle Precambrian can feel so frustratingly quiet. It is not necessarily that evolution stops. Far from it. Genes continue changing, lineages diverge, cells innovate biochemically, symbioses form and dissolve. But much of this remains either invisible to fossilization or invisible to human intuition. The most important developments may be happening at scales that do not yield spectacular remains. Molecular complexity can increase without leaving behind shells. Ecological webs can deepen without producing bodies large enough to preserve clearly. The record, as always, is incomplete, and what survives in the record may understate the amount of experimentation underway. Some of that experimentation likely includes early forms of cellular cooperation. Colonies can form without true multicellularity. Cells can remain attached after division. Different members of a community can perform different roles without becoming tissues in the later sense. These in-between states matter because they show that evolution does not jump directly from solitary microbes to animals. There are many possible halfway strategies, but halfway strategies can become traps as well as bridges. A loose colony gains some benefits of group living without paying all the costs of deep integration. It may never need to evolve further. The path from simple aggregation to fully coordinated multicellular life is not automatic. It requires control over when cells divide, where they move, how they communicate, when they die, and how they suppress selfish behavior for the benefit of the whole. Those are profound biological problems, and they are not solved just because oxygen is present. A lesser-known detail in this long delay is how often biology may have approached greater complexity only to remain limited or to leave little obvious trace. Molecular clock studies, comparisons of genes across living organisms, and the patchy appearance of certain fossil-like structures all suggest that key lineages may have deeper roots than the obvious fossil record alone would imply. But molecular clocks come with uncertainty. Their dates depend on calibration, assumptions about rates of change, and models that scholars continue to refine and debate. What survives in the record suggests that the foundations of later complexity may be accumulating quietly over long intervals rather than appearing in one sudden burst. That possibility makes the silence feel less empty, but it also makes the final burst of animal life even more intriguing. If the groundwork is building for ages, what finally releases it? There is another complication. Oxygen, while useful, remains dangerous. To exploit it safely, cells need biochemical defenses against oxidative damage. They need enzymes and protective systems that neutralize reactive oxygen species before these can shred proteins, membranes, and DNA. That means the oxygen revolution demands not only opportunity but adaptation. Some lineages will manage this better than others. The ability to live with oxygen may therefore evolve step by step, unevenly. and under constraints that slow the spread of truly high-energy, oxygen-powered life. Again, there is no simple key turning in a lock. There is a long negotiation between biology and chemistry. This prolonged negotiation is one reason some researchers resist any single-cause explanation for the delay in complex life. Oxygen matters, certainly, but so do nutrient cycles, trace metals, climate stability, tectonic rhythms, ecological interactions, and the internal evolution of cells. No single explanation fully accounts for the 3 billion year pause. It may not even be a pause in the strict sense. It may be a long period in which many necessary conditions are appearing separately, unevenly, and at different times, without yet combining into a self-reinforcing system. The Earth is assembling the ingredients of complexity one by one, but the recipe has not yet come together. There is something almost unsettling in that thought. The future animal world, with all its motion and appetite and nervous intensity, depends on a sequence of prerequisites so deep and indirect that none of them would announce what they are preparing. Iron rusts in ancient seas. Oxygen flickers into surface waters. Cells struggle with energy limits. Climate lurches. Nutrients wash from continents. Microbial ecosystems thrive, collapse, and reorganize. Somewhere within these quiet changes, the conditions for bodies are being negotiated long before any body large enough to see exists. And yet if the problem were only environmental, perhaps the delay might still be easier to explain. What makes the story truly fascinating is that the bottleneck seems to lie inside life as much as around it. The planet can become more favorable, and still nothing dramatic happens until cells themselves change in a more radical way. They must become internally more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more capable of storing and directing energy. They must find ways to support larger genomes, elaborate gene regulation, and internal transport. They must, in effect, become worlds within worlds. That transformation is still ahead, but its absence may explain much of the strange stillness after oxygen rises. A microbial Earth can tolerate instability because microbes are flexible and small. A complex Earth needs cells powerful enough to bear complexity without collapsing under its costs. Until that threshold is crossed, the world remains full of life yet poor in large forms. The old empire continues, the air shifts, the oceans shift, the stage becomes more prepared. But the actors are not ready. What the long delay reveals, then, is not that evolution is weak or indecisive. It reveals that some innovations are extraordinarily difficult because they require the convergence of planetary change and biological invention. Life must alter the world, and the world must alter life back, until eventually a new kind of cell becomes possible. Only then will the older problem of simple geometry begin to loosen. Only then will multicellularity have a realistic energetic foundation. Only then will the path toward animals truly open. So the silence after oxygen is not empty after all. It is crowded with hidden obstacles, failed approaches, partial solutions, and incremental changes that still do not add up to visible complexity. The biosphere is learning, chemically and biologically, how to support something larger than itself. It has not succeeded yet. But deep inside certain cells, and deep inside the changing conditions of ocean and atmosphere, the next decisive breakthrough is drawing closer. The world does not ease gently toward complexity. It lurches, it freezes, it tests life with conditions so severe that, for a long time, they sound almost exaggerated, as if the planet has slipped into myth. Ice reaches low latitudes. Oceans may be sealed beneath broad sheets of frozen surface water. Sunlight reflects back into space from a whitening Earth, reinforcing the cold. Chemical weathering on land slows under icebound conditions. Ordinary climate feedbacks behave in unfamiliar ways. If the earlier rise of oxygen is the first great atmospheric upheaval, the Neoproterozoic ice ages are among the greatest environmental ordeals that follow. This is the age often associated with Snowball Earth, and whether the globe becomes entirely frozen or only nearly so, the implication is the same. Life is forced through repeated episodes of extraordinary stress, just before the broader arrival of complex multicellular worlds. The timing alone makes these glaciations impossible to ignore. They occur late in the Precambrian, not long before the first strange macroscopic organisms begin appearing in the fossil record. That does not prove cause and effect. Scholars still debate exactly how severe the freezing is, how many separate events occur, and how direct the connection is between these crises and the later rise of animals. But the sequence is suggestive. A planet that has spent most of its history dominated by microbes now enters intervals of climatic extremity that may repeatedly disrupt oceans, nutrient cycles, and ecosystems on a global scale. It is difficult not to wonder whether these shocks help break the long evolutionary equilibrium. To understand why the Snowball Earth idea is taken seriously at all, it helps to picture the geological clues that first made it so compelling. In rocks now found on multiple continents, geologists identify glacial deposits laid down near what appear to have been tropical or near equatorial latitudes. There are sediments that look as though they were dropped from ice into marine environments where such ice should not normally exist. There are also distinctive cap carbonates, unusual carbonate layers sitting directly above glacial deposits, suggesting abrupt transitions from extreme cold to intense greenhouse warmth. Together, these features imply climate swings that are not merely regional. They hint at a planet thrown between states so different that the aftermath of one is written sharply over the remains of the other. No single model explains every detail perfectly, and the evidence remains incomplete in places, as ancient rocks often are. Some researchers favour a near-total snowball Earth, with oceans largely covered in ice from pole to equator. Others argue for a slushball Earth, in which equatorial waters and some open marine refuges remain available beneath thinner or patchier ice. This distinction matters because it changes how survivable the planet appears. A fully frozen ocean seems almost too hostile, raising difficult questions about how photosynthetic life, and especially the ancestors of later complex lineages, would persist. A partially frozen world offers more obvious refuges, though still under punishing conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for every geological and biological clue, and the debate remains active. But however one resolves the details, these glaciations represent planetary stress on a rare scale. Life, however, has already spent billions of years learning how to survive the improbable. Even if the oceans are sealed under ice in many places, not all habitats necessarily vanish. Sea ice can be thin in some regions, fractured in others, or seasonally variable depending on local conditions. Hydrothermal environments on the seafloor continue supplying chemical energy regardless of surface weather. Brine channels within ice may host microbial communities. Open water refuges, if they exist, could preserve photosynthetic ecosystems in narrow belts or isolated pockets. Sediments, deep waters, and sub-ice marine habitats may all shelter lineages through the worst intervals. From the standpoint of a human body, such a world is devastatingly inhospitable. From the standpoint of microbes, and perhaps of some early more complex cells, it may be survivable in fragments. What makes this chapter so important is not just survival, but the way survival under stress can reshape the biosphere afterward. A global or near-global glaciation does not leave the ocean chemistry unchanged. Ice cover can reduce weathering on land and suppress some nutrient delivery while also altering circulation patterns in the sea. If the planet remains frozen long enough, volcanic outgassing can continue feeding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere while normal removal through weathering is greatly reduced. Over immense spans, greenhouse gases build. The frozen state becomes unstable, not because the ice decides to retreat, but because the atmosphere is being loaded with heat-trapping gases beneath the silence of the freeze. When thaw finally comes, it may come hard. The deglaciation phase may be almost as consequential as the glaciation itself. Once warming reaches a tipping point, the collapse of extensive ice cover can trigger a rapid transition toward a greenhouse world. Meltwater pours into the oceans, weathering surges across freshly exposed land. Nutrients may be delivered in unusual abundance. Ocean circulation patterns shift again. Chemical gradients are rearranged. The cap carbonates laid down after some of these events suggest marine chemistry changing with unusual speed. In ecological terms, such transitions can be deeply disruptive, but they can also open opportunity. World stress to the point of simplification sometimes creates space for novelty when conditions rebound. This possibility has fascinated researchers for good reason. Repeated global stress can act as a filter. Lineages unable to tolerate severe instability may be pruned away. Survivors may be those capable of enduring environmental fluctuation, exploiting refuges, or recovering rapidly when conditions improve. At the same time, ecological systems damaged or reset by planetary crisis may leave niches less tightly occupied than before. The microbial empire is resilient, but even resilient systems can be rearranged. If the late Precambrian biosphere experiences repeated collapse and recovery cycles, the long-standing equilibrium that once favored mostly microscopic dominance may begin to loosen. There is also the oxygen question again, now returning in a new form. The relationship between snowball Earth events and oxygenation remains debated, but some models suggest that glaciation, deglaciation, nutrient pulses, and shifts in ocean circulation could help influence oxygen levels in surface and perhaps deeper waters over time. Weathering after deglaciation may deliver phosphorus and other nutrients that stimulate productivity. Burial of organic carbon under certain conditions can, in the long run, affect oxygen balance. At the same time, stratified or chemically unusual oceans can complicate this picture considerably. What survives in the record suggests a world in flux, not a tidy progression. Still, many researchers see the late Precambrian as a period when climate upheaval and biogeochemical change interact in ways that may help make the oceans more favorable to larger, more energy-demanding forms of life. A lesser-known aspect of Snowball Earth is how it changes the emotional scale of the pre-animal world. The earlier Precambrian can feel slow, almost oppressively patient. These glaciations remind us that deep time is not always gentle. The Earth can remain microbial for billions of years and still experience moments of near unimaginable violence, not through impacts or explosions alone, but through systemic climatic reorganization. The seas do not need to boil for the biosphere to be placed under enormous stress. Silence, cold, and duration can be just as transformative. A frozen ocean under a pale sky is its own form of catastrophe. If one tries to imagine standing on the planet during such an interval, the scene becomes almost unbearable in its stillness. Vast bright surfaces reflect a weak sun. The winds move over ice that stretches far beyond any familiar horizon. Coastal margins are locked. Beneath the frozen shell, seawater persists in darkness, carrying traces of older ecosystems and the chemical inheritance of the world before the freeze. Somewhere below, in fractures, sediments, and isolated open leads, life continues. It does not conquer the cold, it endures it. That endurance may be the most important thing about this chapter. The future does not emerge because the Earth becomes steadily more pleasant. It emerges because life keeps surviving worlds that should perhaps have ended it. And survival itself may become a teacher. Repeated environmental crisis can favor flexibility, repair, and cooperation. The evidence does not let us say that glaciations directly invent multicellularity or animal life. That would go too far. But they may intensify selection for traits that later matter: tolerance for fluctuating oxygen, resilience in fragmented habitats, the ability of cells to persist through scarcity, and the ecological clearing that follows catastrophe. Incomplete though the evidence is, the pattern is suggestive. Before large animals become common, the world is shaken hard enough to disrupt ancient routines. There is another reason these glaciations matter. They show how deeply Earth systems are intertwined. Climate cannot be separated neatly from tectonics, weathering, atmospheric composition, ocean circulation, and biology. A change in one feeds into the others. As continents shift, weathering changes. As weathering changes, carbon dioxide balance changes. As climate changes, ice extent changes. As ice extent changes, albedo changes. As ocean chemistry changes, life responds. And life in turn alters chemistry again. By the late Precambrian, the Earth is already a tightly coupled system in which living and non-living processes are impossible to disentangle. The rise of animals will not begin on a blank slate. It will begin on a planet whose systems are already deeply entangled and repeatedly stressed. Scholars still debate how close the connection is between these ice ages and the later evolutionary radiations. Some caution that the timing is too broad or the mechanisms too uncertain to claim a direct line. Others see the repeated environmental disruption as one of the crucial preconditions for breaking evolutionary inertia. Both views capture something important. It is wise not to turn Snowball Earth into a single dramatic answer to a multi-causal problem, but it is equally difficult to believe that such immense climatic trauma leaves no deep biological consequences. No single explanation fully accounts for the later appearance of animals. Yet the frozen Earth almost certainly changes the stage on which that appearance takes place. When the ice retreats, the planet that emerges is not the same one that went in. Oceans are chemically reworked. Nutrient pathways have shifted. Survivors carry the memory of crisis in their continued existence. The biosphere has been compressed, challenged, and forced to recover. If the earlier oxygen revolution is one great act of planetary self-transformation, the Snowball Earth intervals are another deep-time bottlenecks in which Earth experiments with just how much stress life can bear. Still, the breakthrough to animals remains incomplete. Climate crises may loosen the old order, but they do not by themselves build the kind of cell from which animal bodies can be made. The environmental world is being prepared through upheaval, but the biological machinery still has to catch up. That next transformation will happen on a smaller scale than continents or ice sheets. It will happen inside cells, in an innovation so consequential that almost every complex organism alive today still carries it within its tissues. Before Earth can fill with animals, cells must become internally more powerful than anything the old microbial world had yet achieved. The next great change does not first announce itself in the fossil record as a new landscape or a new body. It begins in intimacy, in one cell entering another and not digesting it, in a relationship so improbable and so consequential that nearly every complex organism alive today still bears its mark. If the earlier history of life is the age of microbial empire, this is the moment when some members of that empire begin to merge in a way that changes what a cell can be. The world has already endured chemical revolutions and climatic ordeals. Oxygen exists, though unevenly. Ecosystems have been stressed and remade. But none of that can produce animals until cells acquire the internal power and organization needed to support complexity at a new scale. That transformation lies in the origin of eukaryotic life. A eukaryotic cell is different from a bacterial or archaeal cell not simply because it is larger, though often it is. Its internal architecture is more elaborate. It contains compartments, membranes within membranes, a nucleus to manage genetic material, a cytoskeleton that helps organize shape and movement, and above all, in most lineages, mitochondria, those tiny energy-producing organelles whose ancestry reaches back to an ancient symbiosis. This is one of the deepest truths hidden inside every plant, fungus, and animal body complex life is not built by one lineage alone. It is built from partnership. The prevailing view among biologists is that mitochondria descend from bacteria that took up residence inside another cell long ago. The exact sequence of events remains debated. Scholars still argue about what kind of host cell first took in the bacterial ancestor, whether the relationship began as predation, parasitism, syntrophy, or some other metabolic entanglement, and how quickly the partnership became permanent. The evidence remains incomplete because this was no single fossilizable event. It happened at the level of cells, genes, and biochemical integration. But the broad outline is strongly supported. Mitochondria retain their own DNA. They reproduce by division. Their membranes and molecular systems bear unmistakable marks of bacterial ancestry. They are not inventions from scratch. They are descendants. This matters because the partnership solves a problem that may have constrained life for ages: energy per gene, energy per cell, energy per unit of complexity. A simple cell can survive with relatively modest internal machinery. A more elaborate cell, with more genes to regulate, more proteins to build, more membranes to maintain, and more processes to coordinate, needs much greater energetic support. Mitochondria offer that support by allowing respiration to occur efficiently across internal membranes within the cell. Instead of relying only on the outer surface to manage energy conversion, the cell gains internal power stations. In effect, it expands its energetic capacity without being trapped by the old surface area limits that burden larger simple cells. That may sound technical, but it changes the course of life. A cell with access to much greater energy can afford internal transport, dynamic cytoskeletal systems, larger genomes, more elaborate regulation, and eventually the kinds of developmental programs required for multicellularity. It can manage different tasks in different compartments. It can become, in a sense, an ecosystem inside a membrane. This does not automatically create animals, but without a transition like this, animals in anything like their later form may never be possible. There is something almost eerie about the scale contrast. Continents freeze and thaw, oceans rust, the atmosphere is remade, and then one of the decisive thresholds in Earth history occurs at the level of a cell swallowing another cell and not letting go. Deep time often works like this. The most consequential transformations do not always look grand when they begin. A new metabolism in a microbe can change the air. A partnership between cells can change the future of bodies. The host cell involved in this partnership was not a modern eukaryote waiting conveniently for a bacterial passenger. That would make the story too simple. The host itself was likely an archaeal lineage or something close to the split between major domains of life, already possessing some features that made intimate symbiosis possible. Recent genomic studies have suggested that certain archaea living today may preserve hints of lineages related to this ancient host, including genes associated with membrane remodeling and cytoskeletal behavior. But these modern organisms are not living fossils in any perfect sense. They are survivors of their own long history, not unchanged windows into the past. What they offer is not certainty, but clues that the host cell in this ancient merger was already unusual. The ancient bacterial partner, meanwhile, may initially have been dangerous as much as useful. Symbiosis does not have to begin in harmony. One cell may invade another, a parasite may become a partner, a prey item may resist digestion and continue living inside the host. Metabolic exchange may begin under tension, with each lineage exploiting the other before settling into mutual dependence. Over time, genes move from one lineage to the other. Redundant functions are lost. Autonomy fades. The relationship tightens until separation is no longer possible without death. The mitochondrion, as it later becomes, is therefore not just an organelle. It is the fossil of an ancient negotiation, a merger so complete that the descendants can no longer exist apart. This kind of endosymbiosis is one of evolution's stranger strategies because it creates novelty not just by gradual modification within a lineage, but by incorporation. Life does not merely invent. Sometimes it absorbs. The future animal cell is therefore composite from the beginning, built from formerly independent entities whose fates become inseparable. That composite nature helps explain why eukaryotic cells feel so different from the older microbial model. They are structurally more dynamic. Their internal scaffolding allows shape change, engulfment, transport, and later, the complex choreography of cell division and development. They can move materials from one compartment to another, regulate genes with greater subtlety, and support larger internal complexity without immediate energetic collapse. Still, this breakthrough does not instantly fill the world with macroscopic life either. That is important. The origin of eukaryotic cells is transformative, but again, there is delay. The fossil record suggests eukaryotes emerge long before animals do. Some microscopic fossils interpreted as eukaryotic, whether through size, ornamentation, wall structure, or other features, begin appearing deep in the Proterozoic. There are also strewn biomarkers once thought to provide evidence for ancient eukaryotic life, though interpretations of some biomarker records have become more cautious over time because contamination and later alteration can complicate them. Scholars still debate parts of this evidence, and some claimed early signals remain disputed. But the overall picture points toward eukaryotes existing for a substantial interval before the later animal radiation. Why the delay again? Because eukaryotic cells make complexity possible. But possibility is not the same as immediate outcome. These cells still need time to diversify, time to evolve sexual reproduction, or its precursors in stable forms, time to experiment with multicellularity in different lineages, time to spread through environments that may not yet consistently favor larger bodies. The invention of the eukaryotic cell is like the forging of a new tool. A tool can reshape the future, but only if ecological and evolutionary circumstances give it work to do. One of the most consequential features associated with eukaryotic life is sex, or at least the complex cycles of gene exchange, recombination, and fusion that later become familiar in sexual reproduction. The exact origins of sex are themselves debated. and the earliest forms may not resemble later plant or animal systems cleanly. But recombination allows lineages to reshuffle genes, manage damage, and generate variation in ways that can accelerate adaptation over long timescales. In a world of fluctuating environments, oxygen stress, climatic instability, and new ecological interactions, that capacity may matter immensely. It gives evolution another tool for experimenting beyond the largely clonal strategies that dominate much of the older microbial world. A lesser-known detail in this story is that multicellularity evolves more than once. Plants, fungi, animals, and several other lineages each find their own routes toward bodies made of many cells. That tells us something crucial. Once the eukaryotic threshold is crossed, the landscape of possibility changes. Multicellularity is not a single miraculous accident unique to animals. It becomes an accessible strategy under the right conditions. But accessibility is not inevitability. Different lineages achieve it differently, and many remain unicellular or only loosely colonial, despite possessing the internal complexity that could have supported more. Once again, evolution shows no universal drive toward largeness. It opens doors, then lets circumstance determine who walks through. The sea now contains organisms that still small by later standards, but fundamentally more sophisticated than the old microbial dominion. Some drift as plankton, some live as protists in sediments or on submerged surfaces. Some may form colonies or filaments. Their cells are larger, their internal workings more intricate, their energetic lives richer, yet the world above them still appears spare. Shorelines remain barren. The sediments of the seafloor remain largely unburrowed. No fish flash through the water, no reef bristles with animal architecture. The breakthrough is profound and still almost entirely hidden. What survives in the record suggests that by the middle and late Proterozoic, this hidden revolution is well underway. Eukaryotic algae begin contributing more substantially to marine ecosystems in some settings. Microscopic fossils show increasing variation in form. Cells with more complex walls, processes, spines, and possible cyst stages appear. The biosphere is no longer merely microbial in the older prokaryotic sense. It is becoming layered with new kinds of cells that can support new ecological dynamics. The ancient empire is not gone, but it is no longer alone. And perhaps most importantly, the internal logic of life has shifted. Cells are now capable of maintaining internal complexity instead of being overwhelmed by it. They can compartmentalize, coordinate, and eventually cooperate in deeper ways. That does not guarantee animals, but it makes animals conceivable. The old constraints have not vanished entirely, but they are loosening. No single explanation fully accounts for why this merger happens when it does, why it happens perhaps only once in the lineage that leads to all known complex life, or why its consequences take so long to flower. The record is too fragmentary, the origin too ancient, and the surviving clues too indirect for total certainty. But what survives in the record suggests that somewhere in the deep Proterozoic, cells begin carrying far more power inside them than before. That hidden abundance of energy will one day become muscle, nerve, gut, embryo, and eye. For now, though, those futures remain folded inside the cell. The oceans hold a new kind of life, one capable of greater internal order, greater experimentation, and deeper cooperation. The breakthrough has happened at last, but only at the scale where almost nothing casts a shadow. Before bodies can begin their great experiment, the cell itself has to become a more complicated world. Now that it has, the first fragile attempts at multicellular existence are beginning to stir. Once the eukaryotic cell exists, The next transformation does not arrive as a single triumphant leap. It begins in hesitation, in repeated experiments, in bodies that are barely bodies at all. Cells start staying together longer. Some divide and do not fully separate. Some specialize slightly, taking on different roles within a loose collective. Some form filaments, sheets, hollow spheres, branching structures, or gelatinous clusters that drift through water or cling to submerged surfaces. None of this yet guarantees the later world of animals, but the old isolation of the single cell is beginning to loosen, and with that change the history of life enters a new kind of uncertainty. For billions of years, the most successful strategy has been independence. Now, in scattered lineages, life begins testing dependence. This is a difficult threshold to cross because cooperation among cells is not simply a matter of proximity. A cluster of cells is not automatically an organism. To become something larger in a meaningful sense, cells must coordinate growth, division, repair, and eventually death. They must share resources. They must suppress purely selfish behavior that benefits one cell at the expense of the whole. They must begin to accept different fates within the same body. Some may specialize in movement, others in feeding, others in reproduction, others in support. That kind of arrangement is biologically expensive because it demands trust without consciousness, order without central planning, and mechanisms strong enough to keep the group from collapsing back into a contest among individuals. This is why the earlier steps toward multicellularity are likely uneven and reversible. Loose colonies can form and dissolve. Filaments can break apart. Cells can cooperate under one environmental pressure and return to solitary life under another. Even true multicellularity, once achieved, does not necessarily resemble the later complexity of animals or plants. It may be simple, thin, flat, microscopic, and easily destroyed. The fossil record is therefore again frustrating. Many of the first multicellular experiments are made of soft tissue, lack hard parts, and live in conditions that rarely preserve delicate structure well. What survives in the record suggests increasing complexity, but much of the earliest experimentation may have vanished without obvious trace. Still, some signals begin to emerge. Certain Proterozoic fossils show forms larger and more complex than ordinary single cells. There are multicellular algae, simple colonial organisms, possible early relatives of later lineages, and strange fossil impressions that hint at bodies not easily reduced to microbial mats. In some cases, microscopic fossils preserve ornamentation, wall structures, or developmental patterns consistent with eukaryotic complexity beyond simple solitary living. In others, larger compressions in rock suggest sheets or ribbons of multicellular tissue. These remains do not yet announce animals clearly, but they indicate a biosphere in which life is trying out new scales and architectures. The ocean itself is changing as these experiments unfold. Eukaryotic algae likely become more important producers in some marine ecosystems, especially in surface waters where light and nutrients permit. This matters because the rise of a larger photosynthetic eukaryotes can alter food webs. Bigger cells can be consumed differently than bacteria. They can package energy in new ways, sink differently through the water column, and create new ecological relationships. A world of only microbes is chemically busy but structurally limited. A world with increasingly varied protists and multicellular algae begins to build more layered marine ecosystems, even before animals arrive. The sea is not just filling with more life, it is filling with life at more scales. Some of the most important innovations may happen in development rather than anatomy. For multicellularity to become stable, Cells must know when to divide, where to go, and what role to take. That means gene regulation is becoming more elaborate. Signals must pass from cell to cell. Adhesion molecules must keep tissues together. Structural proteins must help bodies hold shape. These are invisible revolutions, no less important for being hidden. A fragile cluster in ancient seawater may represent not merely more biomass, but a new logic of life, one in which the fate of each cell is increasingly tied to a collective pattern. This is also where evolutionary convergence begins to tell an important story. Multicellularity does not emerge only once in the history of eukaryotes. It appears independently in several major lineages. That fact suggests that once cells acquire the right internal complexity and environmental opportunities, living together becomes an attractive solution to multiple problems. It can help with feeding, with resisting predation, with remaining in favorable habitats, with reproduction, and with managing environmental fluctuation. But the forms it takes differ. The route that leads to seaweeds is not the same as the one that leads to fungi, and neither is identical to the one that leads to animals. The repeated appearance of multicellularity makes the late Precambrian feel less like the sudden invention of bodies and more like the opening of a new design space. And yet the earliest bodies remain strange in their restraint. They do not swarm, bite, or chase. They do not yet tunnel through sediment or build reefs of animal skeleton. They are quiet bodies, soft bodies, bodies that seem almost reluctant to become dramatic. Perhaps that is exactly what one should expect. The first stable multicellular forms do not arise in a world already shaped by predation and rapid motion. They arise in oceans that are still, by later standards, comparatively gentle at the level of visible ecology. Without jaws or claws or burrowing animals to tear habitats apart, there may be room for forms that are thin, frond-like, quilted, or loosely anchored to the seafloor. The earliest large bodies are not necessarily prototypes of later animals in miniature. They may belong to ecological worlds unlike anything familiar. A lesser known and often underappreciated detail is how much of this transition may depend on oxygen thresholds, not simply in the atmosphere, but in particular marine environments. Larger bodies and more active metabolisms require reliable access to oxygen. Yet the late Precambrian oceans may still be chemically patchy. Some shallow and well-mixed waters may be comparatively favourable. Deeper basins may remain poorly oxygenated or even toxic in places because of sulfide or other chemical stress. This patchwork means that the first multicellular experiments may cluster in specific ecological windows rather than spreading everywhere at once. Complexity does not bloom across the whole planet simultaneously. It advances where conditions allow, retreats where they do not, and leaves a record accordingly uneven. There is also the question of predation, or rather the beginning of its possibility, in a world dominated by single cells and loose colonies. Being larger can offer advantages. It may make one harder to engulf. It may allow access to new food sources or new modes of feeding. Some researchers argue that early interactions between predators and prey at the microscopic level help encourage multicellularity, armour, and more elaborate life cycles even before animals in the later sense become common. The evidence for these dynamics deep in the Precambrian is indirect, and scholars still debate how widespread or decisive they are. But what survives in the record suggests that ecological pressure is beginning to diversify. Cells are no longer merely solving chemistry, they are beginning to solve each other. For a long time, these developments remain easy to miss because they do not produce the spectacular fossils of the Cambrian yet. There is no Burgess shale here, no sudden pageant of eyes and limbs. Instead, there are hints larger organic walled microfossils. compressions of simple multicellular algae, possible reproductive structures, unusual impressions in sediment, geochemical signals of changing productivity, and later molecular inferences that suggest deeper roots for animal-related genes than bones or shells will ever show. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points in one direction. The world is no longer only microbial in the old sense. It is becoming inhabited by bodies, though bodies still modest, uncertain, and often hard to classify. This gradualness matters. It prevents the story from turning into a false miracle. Animal life will later seem to explode, but that explosion rises from a long background of cellular and multicellular experimentation. Before there are unmistakable animals, there are problems being solved in advanced adhesion, signaling, developmental timing, oxygen management, feeding at larger scale, reproduction in more complex bodies. The breakthroughs accumulate quietly. The later flourish will depend on them all. At the same time, there is no guarantee that any of these early experiments lead directly to animals. Many likely do not. Evolution is full of side paths, temporary successes, and lineages that vanish after exploring possibilities no later organism inherits. Some multicellular forms may flourish for millions of years and then disappear completely, leaving no living descendants. Others may contribute only small parts of the toolkit that later lineages repurpose. The fossil record of the Proterozoic is therefore both a prelude and a graveyard. It preserves a world in which life is feeling its way toward larger organization without yet knowing, if such a word can even be used, which roots will matter most. What makes this stage so haunting is the sense of tension in the water. The old world has not gone away. Microbes still dominate the great cycles of the planet. Oceans are still chemically uneven. The sea floor remains largely unworked by animals. Yet scattered through this older setting are organisms that have begun to live as coordinated wholes. Their bodies are soft and vulnerable. Their architectures are experimental. They may spread across the seafloor like films or lift into the water as colonies or drift as planktonic structures whose descendants remain uncertain. But they represent a break in the old logic of life. A cell no longer needs to be enough by itself. No single explanation fully accounts for why multicellularity stabilizes in some lineages and not in others, or why these early experiments remain comparatively subdued for so long before the later animal radiations. Environmental patchiness, oxygen limits, ecological competition, developmental complexity, and sheer contingency all likely play roles. What survives in the record suggests progress, but not inevitability. Bodies begin, but cautiously. And then, toward the close of the Precambrian, the fossil record starts to preserve something even stranger, larger soft-bodied forms spread across ancient seafloors. Impressions of organisms that look like fronds, discs, quilts, and branching veins. They are clearly more than microbial films, yet often unlike familiar animals. Some may belong to early branches of the animal story. Others may represent experiments that leave no direct descendants at all. With them, the world of bodies becomes visible for the first time in a more sustained way, and the mystery deepens rather than clears. Life is no longer just experimenting with multicellularity. It is beginning to build entire communities out of these enigmatic forms. The sea floor of the late Precambrian begins to hold shapes that seem at once familiar and deeply wrong. They lie pressed into ancient sediments as impressions of fronds, discs, ribbed ovals, quilted forms, branching veins, and bodies that appear to have grown not by the anatomical logic of later animals, but by some other rule altogether. They are large enough to see clearly with the naked eye, in some cases large enough to dominate entire bedding planes, and yet many of them do not fit comfortably into the categories by which later life is understood. This is the Ediacaran world, and it does not arrive as a simple prelude to the Cambrian. It arrives as its own lost experiment, a biological landscape both recognizable as multicellular life and alien in its organization. For the first time in Earth's history, macroscopic organisms become widespread enough to leave a sustained visual record. Their fossils appear in rocks from multiple continents, suggesting that this is not a purely local oddity, but a broader ecological phenomenon. In Australia's Ediacara Hills, where the interval first lends its name, in Newfoundland, in Namibia, in Russia, and elsewhere, ancient sea floors preserve communities of soft-bodied organisms that once lived in shallow marine settings. Their preservation is itself unusual. Many seem to have been recorded as impressions beneath thin blankets of sediment or volcanic ash, sometimes helped by microbial mats that stabilize the seafloor and capture surface detail. The old microbial empire, still present, may be aiding the preservation of the first visible world of complex bodies. That juxtaposition matters. The Ediacaran is not the first moment when the microbial past disappears. Instead, the new bodies seem to inhabit ecosystems still strongly shaped by microbial surfaces. The seafloor is often described as mat ground, a world where dense microbial films blanket sediment in ways that remain far more stable than later animal-worked sea bottoms. Many Ediacaran organisms appear to rest on or within this quiet surface rather than churning through it. The ecology is therefore unlike the later marine world in a fundamental way. There is still little obvious burrowing. There are few signs of active predation in the later familiar sense. Many organisms appear sessile or only weakly mobile. The seafloor looks populated, but not yet busy. Some forms are easier to approach than others. Frond-like organisms such as Charnia rise from the sediment like soft leaves or feathers anchored to the bottom, built from repeated branching units that give them a strangely modular elegance. Others, like Dickinsonia, are flattened, oval bodies divided into repeated segments or modules arranged around a central axis, though not in the way later bilaterian animals typically are. Still others take the form of discs once interpreted as jellyfish, but now often understood differently, or strange quilted constructions like Sprigina, Yorgia, Tribrachidium, and many others whose affinities remain debated. A few seem almost plant-like in outline despite living in marine settings long before land plants. Others look like nothing alive today. This is why the Ediacaran world has generated so much argument. What are these organisms exactly? Some almost certainly belong somewhere near the animal story. A few may represent early eumetazoans, stem group bilaterians, cnidarian-grade organisms, or other branches connected, however distantly, to later lineages. Trace fossils from the late Ediacaran also hint that some organisms are capable of movement across the sediment, even if the bodies making those traces are not always preserved clearly alongside them. But for many iconic Ediacaran forms, the answer remains unresolved. Scholars still debate whether certain taxa are early animals, giant protists, lichen-like constructs, an extinct kingdom-grade experiment in multicellularity, or something more subtle members of lineages that share some properties with animals while lacking others that later become standard. There was even a period when some researchers proposed that many Ediacaran organisms belong to a fundamentally separate body plan tradition, sometimes grouped under names suggesting an extinct and isolated experiment rather than true ancestors of modern animals. That view in its strongest form is not as widely favoured now as it once was. because detailed study has revealed more complexity and more possible connections to known metazoan or stem metazoan traits in at least some forms. Yet the impulse behind it remains understandable. The Ediacaran biota often feels unlike the Cambrian world that follows. Its organisms are frequently soft, flattened, modular, and enigmatic. They seem optimized for conditions that later marine ecosystems will erase. One of the strangest things about these bodies is their apparent relationship to growth. Some seem to enlarge by adding repeated units, rather than by simply inflating a fixed anatomy. Others show forms of symmetry unfamiliar in later animals, including 3-part rotational patterns as in Tribrachidium. Such organizations suggest that the Ediacaran is exploring developmental possibilities broader than the lineages that later dominate. Evolution, at this stage, is not yet confined to the successful winners recognizable from modern descendants. It is still throwing open doors, many of which will later close. How these organisms live is another central puzzle. Some likely absorb nutrients directly across their surfaces, especially if they are thin-bodied and live in nutrient-rich waters over microbial mats. Others may feed by filtering particles or dissolved organic matter from surrounding water. A few may have had more active strategies, though evidence is limited. The absence of clear mouths, guts, or obvious feeding structures in many forms has encouraged the idea that some Ediacaran organisms belong to ecological modes largely absent from later large-bodied life. If so, that makes them not merely anatomically strange, but strange in how they fit into energy flow itself. They are large bodies in a world not yet organized around the later arms race of mobility, ingestion, and predation. The seafloor communities they form can be extensive. Bedding planes preserve what look like entire living surfaces, with organisms of different sizes distributed across the substrate in patterns that may reflect competition for space, dispersal of offspring, and environmental preference. In some localities, younger individuals cluster around larger ones, perhaps suggesting reproductive strategies involving nearby settlement. In others, community succession can be inferred, with certain forms colonizing first and others appearing later as ecological conditions shift. This is important because it reveals not just isolated oddities, but ecosystems. The Ediacaran world is populated enough to have structure, and yet that structure is delicate. These communities seem tied to the calm, mat-stabilized seafloors of the late Precambrian. Their bodies are mostly soft. Their ecological interactions, at least insofar as the evidence shows, are comparatively gentle. This makes them vulnerable to the kind of world that is coming. Once animals capable of digging, grazing, chasing, and biting begin to spread more widely, the Ediacaran way of life may become difficult to sustain. The very conditions that allow these forms to flourish may contain the seeds of their disappearance. A lesser known but revealing detail is that not all Ediacaran fossils are grand, mysterious body impressions. Some are traces, burrows, surface trails, and other marks hinting that mobility and perhaps simple behavior are beginning to enter the picture more clearly by the end of the period. These traces are often modest compared with later Cambrian complexity, but they matter because they suggest that the Ediacaran is not a static garden of passive forms. Somewhere within these ecosystems, more animal-like ways of living are already emerging. The record captures both the strange established world of fronds and quilts and the first hints of the ecological disruption that may help end it. There have also been intriguing geochemical findings associated with some fossils, including studies suggesting that particular Ediacaran organisms such as Dickinsonia preserve cholesterol-related molecules more consistent with animal affinities than with algae or fungi. Such results have been influential, though interpretations of ancient biomarkers always demand caution, because contamination and later alteration remain concerns. Still, taken together with morphology and context, they strengthen the case that at least some of these iconic forms sit somewhere inside the broader animal story. The trouble is that some does not solve the whole puzzle. The Ediacaran remains a mixed world, perhaps containing early animals, stem animals, unrelated large eukaryotes, and extinct experiments sharing habitats without sharing futures. No single explanation fully accounts for why these organisms look so different from later marine life. Part of the answer may be environmental. They evolve in oceans still chemically uneven, on seafloors still stabilized by microbial mats, before the full intensification of predation and sediment mixing. Part may be historical contingency. Early developmental systems may simply produce forms later lineages abandon. Part may be preservational bias. Soft-bodied organisms that can fossilize under Ediacaran conditions may represent only a subset of the actual living diversity. And part may be that this really is a lost world, one whose dominant body plans largely do not survive the ecological transformations ahead. That sense of loss is essential to the atmosphere of the Ediacaran. It is not only the first clear world of large multicellular life, it is also a reminder that visibility does not guarantee continuity. The first large bodies to spread across ancient sea floors are not necessarily the ancestors of the animals that later dominate. Many may vanish almost completely. They are pioneers in the literal sense, entering open territory before the rules are finalized. And many pioneers do not endure once those rules harden. What survives in the record suggests a marine world poised between stillness and disturbance. Microbial mats still hold the sediment together. Strange bodies rest upon them in quiet abundance. A few traces hint at motion, and perhaps grazing or shallow probing. Developmental possibilities seem broader than in the later fossil record. Ecosystems exist, but they do not yet resemble the frenetic competition of the Cambrian. The Earth has finally produced visible multicellular worlds, and instead of becoming immediately familiar, life becomes more uncanny. This is why the Ediacaran biota matters so much to the larger story. It shows that the path toward animals is not a straight road from simple cells to recognizable creatures. There is a wide zone of experimentation in which complexity becomes large before it becomes familiar. The world is full of bodies before it is full of animals in the later sense. That distinction matters because it means the Cambrian Explosion will not create complexity from nothing. It will overtake, transform, and in many cases erase an older multicellular world already rich with forms history does not keep. And beneath that coming transition, the planet itself is continuing to shift. Oxygen levels in parts of the ocean may be rising further. Nutrients move differently through changing seas. Ecological pressure is growing. Mobility is becoming advantageous. Feeding strategies are diversifying. The calm background world of the Ediacaran cannot remain untouched forever. The Earth is becoming more favorable to active, energy-demanding organisms, and once that threshold is crossed decisively, the old soft-bodied order will begin to give way. The strange seafloor gardens of the Ediacaran are therefore both a culmination and a warning. They prove that after billions of years of microbial dominance, large multicellular life can flourish. But they also show that the first flourishing is not the final one. Another transformation is coming, one that will make the oceans harsher, richer, more dangerous, and more inventive all at once. Before the great burst of unmistakable animal life, the planet has to become ready for it in a deeper way, not just through strange bodies on the sediment, but through the full alignment of ocean chemistry, climate, nutrients, and ecological opportunity. By the end of the Precambrian, the Earth is no longer merely a planet where life survives. It is becoming a planet where life can begin to escalate. That is the crucial change. For billions of years, one limiting factor after another has held complexity in check: too little oxygen, too much chemical instability, cells too simple internally, oceans too unevenly habitable, ecosystems too thoroughly dominated by microbial strategies that leave little advantage for larger bodies. Now, many of those restraints are weakening at the same time, not all at once, not everywhere equally, and not in a way that eliminates uncertainty. But enough changes are converging that the old balance can no longer hold forever. The planet is becoming ready to transform. One part of that readiness lies in oxygen, though the story remains more complicated than any simple threshold model suggests. Atmospheric oxygen has long since risen above the near-zero conditions of the earliest Earth. But what matters increasingly now is how much oxygen is available in the shallow marine settings where larger, more active organisms live, and whether oxygen is beginning to penetrate more persistently into parts of the ocean that were once chemically hostile. There is evidence that oxygenation increases in steps, perhaps with significant fluctuations, rather than as a single steady climb. Some basins may remain poorly oxygenated or intermittently euxinic, rich in sulfide and dangerous to more demanding life. Others appear to become more favourable. Scholars still debate the exact timing and extent of these shifts, because the geochemical signals can be patchy and difficult to interpret. But what survives in the record suggests that late Precambrian oceans are opening more ecological space for larger, more metabolically expensive bodies. This matters because oxygen is not only fuel, it changes what bodies can afford to do. With more oxygen, cells and tissues can support sustained activity, more intensive growth, more complex development, and the energetic maintenance of nervous and muscular systems that are costly even when they are simple. A body that merely lies on the sediment and absorbs nutrients across its surface can survive under conditions that a moving, feeding, sensing organism cannot. Once oxygen availability improves in the right habitats, that difference begins to matter enormously. Motion becomes more practical. Predation becomes more practical. Digestion inside a body becomes more practical than a passive absorption. In other words, oxygen helps turn new anatomical possibilities into viable ecological strategies. But oxygen alone does not prepare a world. Nutrients matter too, especially phosphorus and other elements that help drive productivity in surface waters. The delivery of nutrients depends on weathering, erosion, tectonic arrangement, climate, and ocean circulation. When continents are assembled differently, when mountains rise and are worn down, when ice advances and retreats, the amount and timing of the nutrient flow into the sea can change significantly. After the great Neoproterozoic glaciations, intensified weathering on exposed land may have delivered major pulses of nutrients into marine systems that could stimulate photosynthetic production, alter carbon burial, and affect oxygen budgets in complex ways. Yet nutrient abundance is not a simple blessing either. Too much productivity in a poorly ventilated basin can intensify oxygen depletion at depth. The late Precambrian ocean is therefore not just richer, it is more dynamic, with productivity and redox conditions interacting in ways that vary from place to place. This patchiness may actually be part of the answer. A world uniformly hostile to large complex life suppresses innovation. A world uniformly comfortable may not generate much ecological pressure, but a world made of contrasting habitats, some newly favourable, some still dangerous, may create zones where experimentation pays. organisms that can exploit oxygen-rich shallows, tolerate fluctuations, disperse across habitats, or feed in new ways suddenly have advantages they did not have before. Evolution does not need the entire globe to become ideal. It only needs enough persistent opportunity in enough connected environments for new lineages to survive long enough to diversify. At the same time, the biological toolkit is no longer what it was. Eukaryotic cells are already present, multicellular experiments have already occurred, developmental control, adhesion, signaling, and specialized cell behaviors are already being tested. The Ediacaran world has shown that large bodies can exist, even if many of its dominant forms do not resemble later animals. The significance of this cannot be overstated. By the late Precambrian, life is no longer trying to invent complexity from nothing. It is trying to reorganize complexity into more active, more resilient, and eventually more familiar forms. The raw materials of the animal world are already on the table. Ecology, too, is beginning to tighten. Once organisms become large enough to be worth eating, and once some organisms can move enough to do the eating, a different kind of world begins. The Ediacaran seafloor seems, in many places, comparatively calm, with organisms resting on microbial mats in communities that may have been structured more by space, current, and nutrient access than by constant attack. But the late Ediacaran and earliest Cambrian traces suggest that this calm is starting to break. Trails, shallow burrows, and disturbed sediments hint that some organisms are moving more actively through or across the substrate. That changes everything. As soon as sediment begins to be reworked, microbial mats become less stable. Oxygen can penetrate differently. Nutrients can be redistributed. Habitats that once favoured static mat-ground communities begin to disappear. The ecosystem itself becomes less predictable and more dynamic. This ecological destabilization may be one of the hidden engines of what follows. A quiet mat-ground world allows certain forms of life to flourish for long intervals. A churned seafloor rewards different strategies entirely. Organisms that can anchor more firmly, move, sense, graze, burrow, defend themselves, or reproduce more flexibly begin to gain ground. The old Ediacaran forms may not simply vanish because they are outcompeted in some abstract sense. They may vanish because the physical character of the seabed, the very platform on which they live, is being transformed beneath them. Evolution is not only changing bodies are changing environments, which in turn changes which bodies can persist. There is also the matter of size and timing in development. Larger multicellular organisms need reliable ways to grow from one stage to another without losing organization. They need genes that regulate where the front and back of the body will be, how tissues will differentiate, and how repeated structures will form. Comparative biology suggests that many of the basic genetic systems used in animal development have ancient roots, with some components likely predating the full rise of animals themselves. But the existence of genes alone does not create body plans. Their deployment, interaction, and regulation within living embryos matter more. Somewhere in the late Precambrian, lineages begin assembling developmental systems capable of producing increasingly elaborate bodies with consistent structure. This is another hidden transformation, less obvious in the rocks than shells or trails, but no less necessary. A lesser-known point in this build-up is that the disappearance of the Ediacaran world and the rise of Cambrian animals may not be a single clean replacement event. Some Ediacaran forms likely persist for a time alongside early animal lineages. Some tracemakers appear before many classic Cambrian body fossils do. Some ecological changes begin gradually and only later become unmistakable. The boundary between worlds is therefore fuzzy. That fuzziness matters because it reminds us that major transitions are often experienced locally before they become globally obvious. A new style of life may begin in scattered habitats, on certain shelves, in certain basins, long before the fossil record presents it as a full pageant. Still, there is a cumulative feeling now that was absent in earlier chapters. The prerequisites are overlapping. The air is different. The oceans are different. Cells are different. Bodies are different. The sea floor itself is changing under the pressure of new behaviors. Even the pacing of the story begins to shift. For billions of years, Earth feels patient to the point of stillness. In the late Precambrian, patience starts giving way to momentum. No single explanation fully accounts for why this convergence occurs when it does. Some researchers emphasize oxygen thresholds. Others focus on the ecological consequences of predation and burrowing. Others point to developmental innovation, nutrient delivery, tectonic reorganization, or the recovery from global glaciations. The truth is almost certainly entangled. A planet does not become ready for animals through one cause alone. It becomes ready when multiple causes begin reinforcing one another. Oxygen supports activity. Activity reshapes ecology. Ecology rewards new anatomy. New anatomy changes sediments, nutrients, and food webs. Those changes create further opportunities for selection. Once such feedbacks begin, the old slow world can become surprisingly unstable. What emerges from this instability is not yet the full Cambrian spectacle, but the threshold of it. One can almost feel the marine world tightening before release. Microbial mats still persist but are increasingly challenged. Ediacaran-style communities still exist but are less secure. Small moving organisms begin leaving more frequent traces. Predation, however modest at first, becomes a real evolutionary pressure. Cells and tissues capable of coordinated movement are no longer merely possible. They are becoming advantageous. Bodies that can process food internally, protect themselves externally, and orient themselves through space gain a new ecological meaning. This is the moment before the shoreline changes forever, not because land life appears, which is still far away, but because the oceans are about to stop being the quiet cradle of mostly passive forms and become arenas of interaction. Once animals cross that line decisively, the logic of evolution accelerates. Defense invites attack. Attack invites speed. Speed invites sensing. Sensing invites more elaborate nervous systems. Burrowing changes sediments. Sediments change chemistry. Chemistry changes habitats. The great transformation that later generations call an explosion is not a miracle descending from nowhere. It is the point at which accumulated prerequisites lock together and begin amplifying one another. By now, the planet has spent billions of years assembling this possibility. It has raised oxygen through microbial labor, survived planetary ice, evolved powerful composite cells, experimented with multicellularity, filled the seafloor with strange soft-bodied communities, and begun reorganizing marine chemistry and ecology in deeper ways. All of that preparation has been real, though often hidden. The late Precambrian is when hidden preparation starts becoming visible consequence. The next step will be unmistakable. The fossil record will begin to show animals that are not merely large and enigmatic, but structured in ways later life can recognize more readily, bodies with clear fronts and backs, feeding strategies, sensory equipment, appendages, shells, and the first durable signs of ecological escalation. The threshold is no longer theoretical. It is about to be crossed. The world that spent 3 billion years refusing to produce familiar complexity is finally nearing the point where complexity will no longer remain contained. Then at last the threshold gives way. It does not happen in a single year, or in one impossible morning when the oceans suddenly fill with creatures never seen before. But in geological terms, the change is astonishingly swift. After billions of years in which life remains microscopic, chemically ingenious, and visually quiet, the early Cambrian begins to reveal a marine world crowded with unmistakable animals. Their remains appear in sediments across multiple regions. Their traces score the seafloor. Their bodies show clear organization, distinct axes, specialized tissues, active feeding, and increasingly elaborate ways of moving through space. The pace of visible innovation changes so dramatically that later generations will call it an explosion, and from the perspective of the fossil record, that word remains understandable. The Earth has spent almost all of its history preparing for complexity, and now complexity begins to advertise itself openly. What changes first is not simply diversity, but tempo. The old Precambrian world has long been full of hidden innovations, of cellular revolutions and soft-bodied experiments. The Cambrian threshold is different because those accumulated possibilities begin entering a feedback system that makes further change easier to amplify. Once animals with directed movement, sensory capacity, and internalized feeding structures become common enough, they alter environments and one another in ways that reward further elaboration. The sea is no longer just a place where bodies exist. It becomes a place where bodies interact intensely. The fossil record begins showing this in several forms at once. There are small shelly fossils, tiny mineralized pieces from early animals and animal-like organisms, scattered through early Cambrian rocks like a broken alphabet from newly visible life. Some are tubes, plates, spines, cones, caps, and fragments whose exact owners remain uncertain. Others can be connected more confidently to early mollusks, brachiopods, halkyrids, and other lineages. These remains matter because they signal that hard parts are appearing in greater abundance. The world is not yet filled with the massive skeletons of much later ages, but animals are beginning to armor themselves, support themselves, and leave behind durable traces that fossilization is far more likely to keep. At the same time, trace fossils become more varied and more disruptive. The seafloor is no longer a quiet mat ground with only occasional movement brushed across its surface. Organisms begin burrowing into sediment more deeply and more systematically. They leave networks of trails, feeding patterns, resting marks, and tunnel systems that show bodies using the substrate as habitat, refuge, and food source. This is a revolution in its own right. Bioturbation, the stirring and overturning of sediment by animals, changes the chemistry of the seabed, the availability of oxygen, the stability of microbial mats, and the kinds of organisms that can live there. The old Ediacaran-style substrate world begins to vanish beneath the activity of newcomers. In a sense, the Cambrian threshold is crossed not only in anatomy, but in mud. And then come the bodies themselves, clearer now than before. Bilateral symmetry becomes more obvious in many forms. Front and back matter more, so do top and bottom. Some animals show signs of heads or head-like regions where sensory structures and feeding parts begin concentrating. This phenomenon, later called cephalization, does not have to be fully modern to change everything. Once an organism moves consistently in one direction, it benefits from concentrating sensory input and feeding structures where it meets the world first. The body becomes oriented. That orientation creates a new logic of design. A front end that senses and feeds is not just another shape. It is a declaration of intent. There is a profound change in ecology hidden inside that design shift. A body with a clear front can pursue, probe, select, and avoid. It can move toward food or away from danger with more consistency. It can turn space into information. That does not yet mean intelligence in any familiar sense, but it does mean the world is becoming more interactive. In the old microbial and ediacaran worlds, much of life is chemically responsive and often relatively passive at the scale visible to human eyes. In the Cambrian, active encounter begins to matter more. Organisms now confront one another directly through motion. The threshold is also marked by the diversification of body plans, though that phrase can mislead if handled carelessly. It does not mean that every major animal form appears fully formed all at once, nor does it mean that modern phyla step onto the scene exactly as they exist later. Many early Cambrian animals belong to stem groups, side branches, or intermediate forms that combine traits later sorted into more familiar lineages. But the range of anatomical experimentation becomes extraordinary. Segmented bodies, jointed appendages, spiny armors, tubular dwellings, lobopodian limbs, filter-feeding structures, primitive gills, grasping appendages, mouths ringed with hard parts, and the early machinery of digestion, locomotion, and defense begin appearing in combinations the Precambrian would hardly have recognized. Eyes, or at least image-forming visual systems, are among the most famous and transformative innovations associated with this broader Cambrian change, though they do not emerge everywhere at once or from nothing. Light sensitivity certainly predates the Cambrian. Many organisms long before this threshold likely respond to light in simple ways. But once more, complex visual organs begin evolving in active animals. They intensify ecological interaction dramatically. A world in which organisms can detect one another at distance is not the same world as one organized mainly through contact or simple chemical gradient. Vision favors speed, camouflage, orientation, pursuit, and escape. It turns the water column and seafloor into a more dangerous and information-rich space. This is one reason the Cambrian threshold feels different from all earlier changes. Previous revolutions transform chemistry, climate, and cellular capacity. This one transforms experience, not consciousness in any grand philosophical sense, which remains inaccessible to the record, but lived interaction. For the first time, the oceans are full of creatures for whom the world is not merely something to endure or absorb across a surface, but something to navigate, exploit, and avoid with increasingly sophisticated bodies. The marine realm becomes behavioral in a new way. There is also a shift in feeding itself. Large parts of the Precambrian world seem dominated by absorption, passive collection, microbial grazing, or modes still debated. In the Cambrian, mouths become more common and more obvious. Guts with openings and through processing systems become ecologically important. Some animals scrape, some filter, some scavenge, some hunt, some swallow sediment and extract food from it. Internal digestion allows energy to be handled differently and supports more active lives. It also creates new vulnerabilities. A body with a mouth can be bitten. A body with soft tissue can be pierced. Feeding drives defense, and defense drives further escalation. No single fossil locality captures this threshold entirely, but the broad pattern across early Cambrian sediments is unmistakable. The animal world is no longer tentative. It is expanding. Lineages that had likely been accumulating in low diversity or low visibility begin to diversify more openly. The fossil record becomes richer not only because animals are diversifying, but because many now leave traces more readily preserved shells, tubes, spines, disturbed sediment, recurring body patterns. Part of the apparent explosion is therefore ecological and anatomical, and part is preservational. Once hard parts and active burrowing become common, the rock record has more to work with. Scholars still debate how abrupt this radiation truly is. Molecular clock estimates often imply that the lineages leading to many animal groups begin diverging before their bodies appear clearly in fossils. Some argue that the explosion is partly one of visibility rather than pure origin. Others emphasize that even if hidden roots exist, the ecological and anatomical expansion seen in the early Cambrian remains genuinely extraordinary. These views are not incompatible. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that the Cambrian threshold is both a revelation and a transformation. Some lineages are older than their first famous fossils, yet the ecological reorganization that makes them prominent is still a real event. A lesser-known aspect of this threshold is how patchy and experimental the earliest Cambrian still is. Not every innovation succeeds. Some strange forms appear briefly and vanish. Some lineages mineralize in one environment and not another. Some ecologies remain regionally distinct. There is no clean script in which the future winners are obvious immediately. The early Cambrian still contains uncertainty, oddity, and dead ends. But unlike the Ediacaran, the general direction now is harder to miss. The world is tilting decisively toward animal-dominated marine ecosystems. What survives in the record suggests that the old long silence has not truly been broken by one invention, but by a convergence finally reaching critical mass. Oxygen is sufficient in more places. Cells can support greater internal power. Development can generate consistent, more elaborate bodies. Ecology now rewards mobility, defense, sensing, and predation. Sediments are being reworked. Mat grounds are collapsing as dominant substrates. Hard parts are beginning to proliferate. Each factor reinforces the others. Once that cycle begins, change accelerates. For nearly 3 billion years, life has been evolving in ways that remain mostly microscopic or hidden. At the Cambrian threshold, hidden history becomes visible consequence. The bodies that appear are not modern in any simple sense, but they are unmistakably animals in their logic directional, integrated, active, and increasingly specialized. A seafloor once ruled by microbial quiet and enigmatic fronds now hosts creatures that crawl, burrow, grasp, sense, and consume. The world has crossed into a new kind of biology, and once that new biology exists, it does what evolution always does when opportunity and pressure meet. It diversifies, improvises, and begins remaking the environment around itself. The threshold is crossed. What follows is not merely more animals, but an arms race of innovation that will make the next stretch of time one of the most inventive in the entire history of the planet. Once animals begin interacting intensely, the world stops being quiet in a way it never truly recovers from. The Cambrian seas do not simply contain more bodies than before, they contain conflict, pursuit, defense, disruption, and opportunity woven together into a self-reinforcing ecological machine. This is the deeper meaning of the Cambrian explosion. It is not only that many animal lineages appear or diversify within a geologically compressed interval, it is that animals begin changing one another so rapidly, and changing their environment so thoroughly, that evolution itself seems to pick up speed. The sea floor, the water column, even the logic of survival are being rewritten at once. One of the clearest signals of this transformation is the spread of mineralized armor and support structures. Shells, spines, plates, tubes, and hardened outer coverings begin to appear across a widening range of organisms. Some of these structures may first serve support, protection from environmental stress, or storage of minerals. But once predation becomes a persistent force, armor takes on new meaning. A body no longer needs protection only from chemistry or current. It needs protection from other bodies. Hard parts are therefore both a defense and a provocation. They deter some attackers, but they also encourage the evolution of animals capable of crushing, prying, drilling, grasping, or bypassing them. A protected world becomes an arms race world. That phrase can sound too modern, too dramatic, yet it captures something real. When one lineage evolves a better way to feed, another lineage is pressured to evolve a better way not to be fed upon. When prey hardens its outer surface, predators may evolve stronger mouth parts, more precise appendages, greater mobility, or more sophisticated senses. When predators become faster, prey may become better at hiding, burrowing, detecting movement, or reproducing rapidly enough to absorb losses. The Cambrian seas are not merely diverse, they're interactive in a way that continuously rewards new solutions. A static body plan becomes harder to maintain when neighbours are changing around it. Predation is central to this shift, even if the earlier stages are more varied and less cinematic than later imagination often prefers. The first predators are not necessarily giant monsters sweeping through the sea in constant violence. Some may be small organisms grazing on softer tissues, probing into sediment, engulfing smaller prey, or stripping microbial films and organic matter from surfaces more aggressively than before. But once tissues become food in a sustained ecological sense, anatomy responds. Mouthparts become more specialized. Grasping appendages begin to matter. Tough exteriors are selected for. Movement becomes a survival trait, not just a convenience. It is the cumulative pressure of countless interactions, not merely the existence of a few dramatic hunters, that transforms the world. The sea floor feels this immediately. Burrowing intensifies. Organisms move through sediment for food, shelter, and escape. This destroys or fragments the stable microbial mat grounds that dominate so much of the earlier world. Sediments become mixed. Oxygen penetrates differently. Chemical gradients are disturbed, and habitats that once favoured quiet, soft-bodied communities become unstable. This transition has been called the agronomic revolution, and the term is useful because it suggests a change in how the substrate itself is used, almost as if the seabed is being ploughed by a life for the first time. Once animals begin engineering sediments through ordinary behaviour, every organism living on or in those sediments faces a new environment. This engineering is among the most important but least immediately glamorous parts of the Cambrian story. It means that animals are not just responding to ecological change, they're generating it mechanically. Every tunnel, scrape, feeding groove, and resting trace alters oxygen flow, microbial communities, nutrient release, and sediment texture. Small bodies can have large consequences when they are abundant. A seafloor reworked by millions of burrowing and crawling animals is chemically and physically different from one held together by microbial films. In that altered ground, new opportunities open for some organisms and close for others. The older Ediacaran world of surface-bound soft forms becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Movement also changes scale and meaning. In the Precambrian, many large organisms appear fixed in place or only modestly mobile. In the Cambrian, directed locomotion becomes increasingly central. Lobopodians crawl on soft limbs. Early arthropod relatives use jointed appendages. Worm-like animals push through sediment or swim through the water. Mobility allows escape, but it also allows search. Food no longer needs to come to the organism. The organism can go to the food. That simple reversal has immense consequences. It favours bodies that are bilaterally organised, front-directed, muscled, and increasingly equipped with sensory structures concentrated where decisions matter most. This is where eyes, or at least more sophisticated visual systems, become so transformative. The evolution of image-forming eyes in some Cambrian animals, most famously in trilobites and other arthropod-related groups, does not merely add another sense. It changes the geometry of interaction. A predator that can detect prey at distance does not need to wait for contact. A prey organism that can detect approach has more reason to evolve rapid response, camouflage, sheltering behavior, or defensive armor. Vision turns space into strategy. It creates a wider circle of danger and opportunity around every body. A marine world with vision is not just more visible to itself, it is more urgent. The evolution of larger and more elaborate digestive systems is another major part of this reinvention. Through guts, with distinct openings for intake and exit. Make feeding more efficient in active bodies because organisms no longer need to stop processing one meal before taking another. That matters when energy demand rises. As bodies become more mobile, more muscular, and more behaviorally complex, they need better throughput. A digestive tract is not dramatic to look at in a fossil impression, but it represents a deep reorganization of how a body lives. It allows longer animals, more specialized feeding strategies, and internal processing at scales that passive absorption cannot match. Segmentation, in some groups, becomes another powerful solution. Repeated body units can support flexible movement, redundancy, and the elaboration of specialized appendages over evolutionary time. In early arthropods and annelid-like forms, segmentation allows the body to become both modular and adaptable. Joints, limbs, and repeated structures can be modified without reinventing the whole organism from scratch. This may help explain why some of the most evolutionarily successful Cambrian lineages belong to segmented or semi-segmented designs. Modularity offers evolvability. The Cambrian seas are therefore not just filling with many forms, they're filling with new design principles, bilateral organization, directed locomotion, concentrated sensory structures, internal digestion, hard external defenses, repeated modular anatomy, active sediment engineering. These principles interact. A burrower needs a body that can move through substrate. A predator benefits from a front end, a gut, and sensory concentration. A prey animal benefits from armor, speed, or concealment. The more these solutions spread, the more the ecosystem rewards further refinement of them. Of course, the fossil record preserves this transformation unevenly, and preservation itself shapes the drama. Soft tissues still vanish easily in most conditions. Many early animals are known only from fragments, traces, or isolated hard parts. That is why exceptional fossil deposits matter so much, because they reveal the hidden richness behind the standard record. But even without those extraordinary windows, the broad pattern is visible. There's more movement, more mineralization, more substrate disturbance, more ecological differentiation, and more structured animal anatomy than ever before. The explosion is visible not only in famous fossils, but in the changing logic of sediments and body remains worldwide. A lesser-known detail is that not every Cambrian animal is a fast-moving predator or heavily armored prey. Many are filter feeders, deposit feeders, scavengers, or creatures occupying quieter niches in the expanding marine web. That matters because ecological revolutions are not sustained by violence alone. They require support systems, suspended particles, microbial films, decaying matter, and sedimented organic material all become food for different body types. This diversification of feeding modes helps stabilize the broader animal ecosystem. The Cambrian Explosion is not just a race between hunter and hunted. It is the construction of a full community in which energy moves through many channels. Still, predation remains one of the most powerful intensifiers because it rewards innovation so directly. The first time a lineage evolves an effective new attack strategy, it changes the selection pressures on multiple other lineages at once. This network effect may be one reason the Cambrian appears so rapid. Evolution is no longer operating mostly in isolated chemical niches. It is operating in dense ecological contact. A successful novelty can ripple outward through the whole community. No single explanation fully accounts for the pace of this reinvention. Oxygen, developmental genetics, ecological escalation, nutrient conditions, and preservational biases all contribute. But once the process starts, it becomes easier to see why it accelerates. Animal life is now both the product of planetary preparation and the generator of new conditions. It stirs sediment, alters nutrient cycling, consumes biomass in new ways, and multiplies the value of speed, armor, and sensation. Life is no longer only adapting to Earth. Animals are actively redesigning the biosphere's visible layer. The emotional atmosphere of the planet changes with them. A late Ediacaran seafloor can feel still, even when populated. A Cambrian seafloor feels tense. There are trails crossing other trails, burrows under surfaces, bodies with spines and plates, appendages probing mud, mouth parts testing what can be swallowed, and eyes beginning to turn water into warning. The sea has become an environment where being detected matters, where delay has a cost, and where the body itself becomes a weapon. A shield or a machine for search? For billions of years, life evolves mostly without that atmosphere. Now the atmosphere arrives all at once. The Cambrian Explosion is therefore not only about the origin of animals, it is about the origin of an ecological world that feels recognizably animal, restless, competitive, inventive, and unstable in the most productive way. From here onward, the planet will still host microbes everywhere, and many quiet strategies will persist. But the visible story of life will increasingly be shaped by bodies interacting in conflict and cooperation at scales large enough to leave a dramatic fossil record. And yet the Cambrian remains full of creatures so strange that even with all this new familiarity, the world still does not quite look modern. Many of its most iconic animals seem to come from experiments later evolution does not keep intact. To understand just how inventive this interval really is, it helps to enter the extraordinary fossil windows where the lost details survive, and where creatures appear that seem almost too improbable to belong to the same Earth as anything alive now. If the standard Cambrian fossil record shows the outline of an explosion, the exceptional fossil sites show its face. In ordinary sediments, the history of early animals is broken into fragments: a shell here, a trail there, a spine, a tube, a bit of disturbed mud. But in a few rare places, burial happens under conditions so unusual and so favourable that soft tissues survive as impressions, films, or mineralized ghosts. Limbs remain attached, guts are preserved, eyes, gills, appendages, feeding structures, and body outlines that normally vanish into decay are caught before they disappear. These deposits are not just richer than the usual record, they reveal a world far stranger than the ordinary record alone could ever suggest. The most famous of these windows is the Burgess Shale of British Columbia, though it is not the only one. There are also the Chengjiang Biota in China, Sirius Passet in Greenland, and other Cambrian legostetten that preserve soft-bodied organisms in extraordinary detail. Together they show that the Cambrian seas are not populated merely by simplified ancestors of familiar creatures. They are populated by experiments, hybrids, side branches, and lineages whose body plans seem at first glance almost surreal. Some are close to later successful groups. Others sit on stems leading toward modern phyla, but carry combinations of traits never seen again. Still others once seemed so bizarre that they were briefly imagined as belonging to entirely separate evolutionary worlds. That reaction is understandable, because many Cambrian animals look as though anatomy is still trying out too many possibilities at once. Anomalocaris, for instance, appears like a predator assembled from multiple ideas that later evolution distributes more cleanly: a flexible, segmented body with lateral swimming flaps, large compound eyes, a circular mouth structure built from hard plates, and grasping frontal appendages adapted for seizing prey. For decades, its parts were misidentified as belonging to different organisms entirely, which is a fitting reminder of how alien the Cambrian can seem when encountered piece by piece. Only later did paleontologists realize they were reconstructing one of the most formidable predators of its time. Then there is Opabinia, perhaps the emblem of Cambrian strangeness. Its body is segmented and flanked by lateral lobes, but what arrests attention is the front 5 eyes and a flexible proboscis ending in a grasping claw. Even now it looks improbable, as though evolution briefly entertained a geometry of perception and feeding that later lineages declined to keep. Yet Opabinia is not a meaningless curiosity. It helps illuminate the evolutionary experimentation surrounding the origin of arthropod-like designs. The strange becomes informative once it is placed not outside the tree of life, but near one of its great branching points. Hallucigenia is another case, famous for having first been reconstructed upside down, with its defensive spines mistaken for walking stilts. Once corrected, it becomes a lobopodian, a soft-bodied creature walking on paired limbs beneath a row of spines. It seems fantastical only because later evolution rarely preserves such exact combinations. In context, Hallucigenia and similar forms reveal the early stages of lineages related to arthropods, velvet worms, and other ecdiozoans. They are less monsters than rough drafts, though rough draft is perhaps unfair, because they are successful organisms in their own right. The Cambrian is full of such creatures, not failures, not mistakes, but viable answers to a world that has only recently become crowded with active animals. This is one of the most important lessons of the exceptional fossil sites. Early animal evolution is not a clean parade of winners. It is a densely branching experiment in which many anatomies coexist, some destined for long futures, others for extinction. Trilobites, for example, are more familiar to modern eyes, with their segmented bodies, mineralized exoskeletons, and clear bilateral organization. They will become one of the great success stories of Paleozoic seas. But alongside them live forms like Wiwaxia, covered in scales and spines and long debated for its affinities, Morella, with elaborate head spines and a delicate arthropod-like body, and a host of worm-like, spiny, shelled, stalked, or lobed organisms that complicate every tidy classification. Some of the confusion surrounding these animals has eased with better fossils and better methods. Features once thought unique and baffling have often turned out to be early versions of structures later lineages refine in more recognizable ways. Cladistic analysis, developmental biology, and comparisons with living animals have helped place many Cambrian organisms within broader evolutionary frameworks. The truly radical isolation once proposed for some forms has generally narrowed. But narrowing is not the same as simplification. Even when a creature can be placed on a stem lineage leading toward arthropods, echinoderms, chordates, or other phyla, its combination of traits can still be astonishingly strange. That strangeness matters because it shows how much morphological space evolution explored before later pruning reduced the visible possibilities. The Burgess Shale and Xinjiang also preserve something even more revealing than odd anatomy: whole communities, predators, grazers, scavengers, filter feeders, burrowers, bottom walkers, swimmers, and attached organisms appear together, sometimes with soft tissues intact enough to reconstruct how they lived. This helps transform the Cambrian from a museum of curiosities into an ecosystem. Anomalocaris is not simply bizarre, it is part of a food web. Early arthropod relatives are not just ancestral forms, they occupy niches, move through habitats, and interact with sediment and prey. Worm-like organisms turn over substrate. Sponges and sponge-like forms filter water. Hyoliths, brachiopods, and other shelly animals attach, feed, and persist within these communities. The weirdness of the Cambrian is ecological, not merely anatomical. There is also a humbling preservational lesson here. Without these rare deposits, a large part of early animal history would look much narrower and more straightforward than it really is. Hard parts alone favour certain lineages and certain body regions. Soft body diversity vanishes. Behavioural nuance is lost. Exceptional preservation reveals just how much ordinary rock hides. That means the Cambrian explosion is not only a story of evolutionary innovation, but also a reminder that absence in the fossil record does not equal absence in life. The evidence remains incomplete everywhere except in these rare windows, and even these windows are selective in their own ways. What they reveal is immense, but it is still not the whole sea. A lesser known but important feature of these fossil sites is how early some key lineages already appear within them. There are probable early vertebrate relatives and chordates, such as Milacunmingia, Hyquicthys, or Pikaia-like forms, depending on the deposit and interpretation. They are small, delicate, and easily overshadowed by the more flamboyant arthropod-related creatures, yet their presence matters enormously. Hidden among the spines, lobes, and armoured shells are organisms bearing the early architecture that much later gives rise to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The future is present in miniature among the strangeness. The same can be said for echinoderm relatives, mollusk-related forms, annelid-like worms, preapulid predators, and the many stem groups that foreshadow later success without yet resembling it neatly. This is why the Cambrian can feel both alien and familiar at once. It contains ancestors, but rarely in the form one might expect. The roots of modern animal diversity do not look polished. They look improvised. Some of the most famous debates in paleontology have played out over these fossils precisely because they challenge categories. Are certain forms true arthropods or only close relatives? Does a given worm belong near preapulids, annelids, or some extinct side branch? How should one interpret feeding structures, segmentation, and appendage arrangement in bodies unlike any modern organism? Scholars still debate many of these details. New fossils, new imaging techniques, and reanalysis continue to revise established interpretations. No single classification scheme captures the Cambrian perfectly, because the Cambrian is the interval in which many of the distinctions later taken for granted are still emerging. That is why these deposits matter so deeply to the larger mystery. They show that the explosion is not simply a matter of more fossils appearing. It is an explosion of morphological possibility. Evolution has entered a phase in which many body architectures are viable at once, and the pruning that later makes animal life seem orderly has not yet done its work. To walk mentally through a Cambrian sea is to encounter a biosphere full of options, not all of which will survive the next few 100 million years. At the same time, one must resist the temptation to exaggerate this into pure chaos. The Cambrian is not a random carnival. Many of its strange forms fit within understandable evolutionary patterns once enough evidence is available. Arthropod-related designs are proliferating because segmentation, appendages, and exoskeletal support work extremely well. Worm-like bodies remain common because they are versatile for burrowing and predation. Filter feeding and suspension feeding strategies flourish where water movement and plankton permit. Spines and shells spread because defense matters. The exotic surface of the Cambrian is grounded in real ecological and developmental logic. It is just that the logic is producing forms later ages will often simplify or eliminate. This tension between logic and strangeness may be the most beautiful thing about the period. The animals are not fantastical in a meaningless way. They are fantastical because evolution is still close to its branching points, where multiple solutions to the same problem have not yet been narrowed by later history. Seeing them in the fossil record is like seeing language before orthography stabilizes, when many spellings and structures coexist before convention decides which will persist. What survives in the record suggests that these lost experiments are not marginal to the Cambrian explosion. They are its essence. The interval matters not because it produces only the ancestors of modern animals, but because it produces a far wider field of anatomical possibility from which modern animals are only one surviving subset. That widens the emotional force of the story. The explosion is not merely the triumphant birth of the familiar world. It is also the disappearance of many possible worlds that briefly became real, and that, in turn, brings the central puzzle into sharper focus. Why does this burst of invention happen here and not 2 billion years earlier? Why does Earth wait through oxygen revolutions, glaciations, cellular mergers, and soft-bodied experiments before finally allowing this flood of forms? The fossils show what happens. They do not settle why. To understand that, one has to step back from the creatures themselves and compare the competing explanations. Because even now, with all the stones and all the strange bodies laid out, no single answer fully accounts for the timing of the explosion. By the time the Cambrian world comes into view in all its restless abundance, the temptation is to search for a single decisive cause, one master key that finally unlocks what 3 billion years had withheld. It is an understandable temptation. The delay is so long, and the visible burst so dramatic that the mind wants a clean answer. Perhaps oxygen rises high enough. Perhaps development discovers the right genetic toolkit. Perhaps predators appear and drive escalation. Perhaps the fossil record is misleading, turning a gradual process into a sudden one. Each of these ideas captures part of the truth. None of them, on its own, fully explains why animal life explodes when it does. The timing remains one of the great deep time puzzles, because the answer appears to lie not in one cause, but in a convergence of causes that only become transformative once they begin reinforcing one another. Oxygen is often placed first in these explanations, and for good reason. Complex active animals require substantial energy. Muscles, nervous systems, internal digestion, growth, repair, and movement through water all impose energetic costs far beyond those carried by most microbial or passive multicellular forms. Aerobic metabolism provides a powerful way to meet those costs. It is therefore difficult to imagine the Cambrian radiation occurring in a world with persistently negligible oxygen. Yet the oxygen explanation becomes less satisfying the closer one looks. Oxygen rises in meaningful ways long before the Cambrian, even allowing for fluctuations and patchy ocean chemistry. There is a large gap between initial oxygenation and the major animal diversification. If oxygen were the sole barrier, complexity should perhaps have arrived much sooner. What this suggests is that oxygen is necessary but not sufficient. A world can contain oxygen and still fail to support an animal-style biosphere if that oxygen does not reach the right habitats, or if cells and ecosystems are not yet prepared to exploit it. Many researchers now think in terms of thresholds rather than simple presence. There may have been particular levels of oxygen in shallow marine environments below which active bilaterian bodies remained difficult to sustain at scale, or below which developmental and ecological complexity could not become robust. There may also have been repeated rises and falls, regional differences, and interactions with sulfur-rich or otherwise stressful ocean chemistry that made the path to animal life less direct than earlier narratives assumed. Oxygen still matters profoundly. It simply acts as one thread in a larger web. Another major explanation focuses on developmental genetics. Animals do not emerge merely because more energy becomes available. They require bodies that can be patterned reliably, fronts and backs, tops and bottoms, inside and outside, tissues that specialize, embryos that move through orderly stages without collapsing into disorganization. The genes involved in development, including signaling pathways and regulatory networks with deep roots in animal biology, are clearly central to this process. Some researchers have argued that once these toolkits evolved, especially mechanisms for specifying body axes and cell fates, the diversification of animal forms could proceed rapidly. This helps explain how, once the threshold is crossed, body plans proliferate with surprising speed. Yet this explanation also leaves something unresolved. Genetic toolkits do not operate in a vacuum. The presence of genes does not guarantee that the ecological world is ready for the anatomies they can produce. Many components of animal development likely predate the Cambrian itself. Some may have been present in simpler multicellular ancestors, or early stem animals living long before their descendants became prominent in the fossil record. If so, the toolkit exists before the explosion. Again, a prerequisite is present before the event it supposedly explains. That does not make the explanation wrong. It means the toolkit is one part of a delayed system, not the whole mechanism. Predation and ecological escalation provide another powerful line of interpretation. Once animals begin eating other animals in sustained ways, selection intensifies dramatically. Armor, burrowing, speed, sensing, grasping, vision, and more elaborate feeding structures all become newly valuable. This creates positive feedback. A better predator drives better defenses. Better defenses drive better attack strategies. Ecosystems diversify because ecological roles become more distinct and more unstable. Many paleontologists see this ecological escalation as one of the main reasons the Cambrian becomes so inventive so quickly. The rise of predation turns evolution outward, forcing bodies to respond not just to environment but to other bodies. This explanation is deeply persuasive, but it too may be better at explaining acceleration than origin. Predation can intensify change once animals exist in some complexity already. It may not explain why animal-grade organisms arise in the first place after such a long delay. It also depends on other preconditions: enough oxygen for active lifestyles, enough anatomical integration for movement and directed feeding, enough ecological opportunity for attack and defense to matter. Predation is perhaps best understood not as the first cause, but as the amplifier that makes the explosion visible. There is also the argument that the Cambrian explosion is, to some extent, an explosion of preservation rather than of pure evolutionary novelty. This does not mean it is an illusion. It means that changes in what fossilizes may exaggerate the abruptness of changes already underway. Hard parts such as shells, spines, plates, and mineralized exoskeletons are far more likely to survive in ordinary sedimentary records than soft tissues. Burrowing organisms leave traces even when their bodies decay. Once animals begin mineralizing and disturbing sediment widely, the fossil record suddenly becomes richer. Some lineages that appear to originate in the Cambrian may in fact have deeper roots hidden in poorly preserving earlier worlds. Molecular clock analyses often support this possibility, suggesting that divergences among major animal lineages begin before their classic Cambrian fossils appear. But preservation is not the whole answer either. Exceptional fossil sites, trace fossils, and geochemical context all indicate that the Cambrian is not merely a recording artifact. The ecological transformation is real. Sediments are churned differently, food webs reorganize, body designs proliferate, even if some lineages predate their famous fossils. The visible and ecological burst remains a genuine event. Preservation sharpens the contrast, but it does not invent it. Nutrient availability and Earth system change offer another layer. The delivery of phosphorus and other key nutrients to the oceans depends on tectonics, weathering, climate, and sea level. Following Neoproterozoic glaciations and tectonic reorganization, marine nutrient fluxes may have increased in ways that supported more productive surface waters and more complex food webs. Increased productivity can support larger populations, more trophic levels, and more energetic lifestyles. It can also influence oxygen budgets through organic carbon burial, but nutrients are double-edged. Too much productivity in poorly ventilated settings can intensify anoxia. The effects are context-dependent. This again points away from a single linear cause and toward a complex interaction among tectonics, weathering, biogeochemistry, and biological innovation. Some researchers emphasize the role of the seafloor itself. The late Precambrian macground world provides stable surfaces favorable to certain soft-body communities, while the onset of bioturbation destroys that stability and creates a new substrate ecology. Once animals begin reworking sediment, habitats change chemically and physically, opening some niches and closing others. This substrate revolution may have been essential for the spread of more active and diverse animal communities. It is a striking example of organisms changing selection pressures by transforming the environment beneath them. But again, the ability to engineer sediment depends on animal bodies that already possess movement and feeding structures. Cause and consequence braid together. Then there is contingency, the most unsatisfying answer and perhaps one of the truest. Evolution is not guaranteed to discover every viable possibility as soon as it becomes physically possible. Some innovations may require improbable sequences of prior events. Endosymbiosis, stable multicellularity, developmental control, ecological opportunity, and survival through climate crises may each have involved bottlenecks or rare transitions that did not happen quickly, simply because they were hard to happen. A planet can host life for billions of years without wanting animals. The long delay may partly reflect the absence of any law saying complexity must arrive early. Once enough enabling conditions accumulate, the transition can seem inevitable in retrospect, but perhaps it was never inevitable at all. What makes the problem so compelling is that each explanation illuminates a different part of the sequence. Oxygen explains energetic possibility, endosymbiosis explains cellular capacity, developmental toolkits explain anatomical organization. Ecological escalation explains rapid diversification. Preservation explains why the record sharpens when it does. Nutrient and tectonic changes explain why planetary context becomes more favorable. Contingency explains why none of this happens on a timetable comfortable to human expectation. No single explanation fully accounts for the Cambrian explosion because the explosion is not a single kind of event. It is cellular, ecological, geological, chemical, and historical all at once. This layered answer can feel less satisfying than a clean revelation, but it may actually fit the grandeur of the story better. Earth did not resist complexity for 3 billion years because one lock remained shut. It resisted because many locks were still closed, and because some of them had to open in sequence. A world without oxygen-rich niches could not support energetic animals. A world without eukaryotic cells could not support the internal costs of large multicellular bodies. A world without developmental coordination could not produce reliable body plans. A world without ecological interaction intense enough to reward innovation could not generate rapid diversification. A world without the right preservational conditions would hide much of what did happen. Only when these conditions began overlapping did the long silence finally break into visible abundance. There is a sobering implication in that. The animal world is not the default outcome of life. It is the product of a rare alignment stretched across deep time. Billions of years of microbial labor alter the air. Ancient cellular mergers create new energetic possibilities. Global ice ages test the biosphere and perhaps reset ecosystems. Strange, soft-bodied worlds experiment with large form. Ocean chemistry shifts. Sediment ecology changes. Then, only then, does the visible burst arrive. The Cambrian explosion is therefore not merely a beginning. It is a delayed release of accumulated history. Scholars will likely continue debating the relative weight of each explanation, because the evidence comes from different fields using different kinds of inference. Geochemists read ancient redox conditions from isotopes and trace metals. Paleontologists read bodies and traces from stone. Molecular biologists infer deeper divergences from living genomes. Developmental biologists reconstruct what kinds of regulatory systems might have existed before clear fossils appear. These approaches do not always line up perfectly, and that is part of the fascination. The mystery remains alive because the deep past preserves its answers in different languages, and those languages do not always say exactly the same thing. What they do say, taken together, is that the explosion is real, but not magical. It is astonishing, but not disconnected from what comes before. It is rapid by geological standards, but built from immensely slow preparation. It is both a revolution and the moment when long-hidden revolutions finally intersect. The fossils show the result. The rocks, cells, and oceans behind them show the cost. And once that convergence has happened, its consequences do not end in the Cambrian. The body plans that survive, the ecological strategies that stabilize, and the sensory and anatomical systems that prove durable will carry forward into every later chapter of animal history. The explosion is not just about what appears, it is about what remains, and about how much of the modern world still lives inside that ancient turning point. What survives from the Cambrian is not only a gallery of strange creatures and vanished experiments. What survives is a framework. By the end of this long transformation, the world has crossed a boundary it will never fully uncross. Animal life will continue changing, suffering extinctions, radiating into new forms, leaving the oceans for land, filling forests, skies, deserts, and ice. Entire dynasties will rise and vanish. Trilobites will disappear. Dinosaurs will come and go. Mammals will expand, primates will emerge, humans, much later, will begin telling the story backward from their own brief place in it. But beneath every later chapter lies an older inheritance. The Cambrian does not produce the modern world in finished form. It produces the underlying grammar from which much of the modern world can be written. The grammar begins with body architecture, bilateral symmetry, concentrated sensory structures, internal digestive tracts, tissues specialized for movement and support, developmental systems capable of building repeated patterns and differentiated parts, the ecological logic of active feeding and defense, the use of mineralized tissues for protection and structure, the reworking of sediments by ordinary behavior, all of these become enduring themes. Not every later animal lineage preserves each feature in the same way, and some evolve them independently or modify them beyond easy recognition. But the deep framework is there. The Cambrian establishes a world in which bodies can be oriented, mobile, interactive, and ecologically entangled at scales that make later animal evolution possible. This inheritance is especially visible in the lineages that endure beyond the early Paleozoic and continue diversifying into the present. Arthropods, already among the great innovators of the Cambrian, never lose their hold on Earth. Their segmented bodies, exoskeletons, and appendage-based versatility proves so effective that they will later dominate marine ecosystems, colonize land, and eventually take the air as insects, mollusks, annelids, brachiopods, echinoderms, cnidarians, sponges, and many other groups carry forward body plans or body plan fragments forged in the same broad, deep time interval. Even chordates, modest and easily overlooked in the earliest record, preserve the structural inheritance that one day produces vertebrates, jaws, fins, limbs, feathers, fur, and hands. That last point is easy to miss because the first chordate-like creatures are so small and pale beside the flamboyant drama of Cambrian arthropods and predators. Yet they matter profoundly. Hidden within those delicate early bodies is the architecture of a nerve cord, supportive axial structure, and musculature organized in ways that later evolution can elaborate into fish and, through unimaginable distance, into everything from salmon to whales to hawks to humans. The ancient shock of the Cambrian does not only shape what is obvious in the early fossil record, it also shapes futures too faint to see yet. There is something almost unsettling about that continuity. Human beings tend to imagine themselves as creatures of recent history, and in a narrow sense they are. The species is extraordinarily young. Civilization is younger still. Writing, agriculture, cities, and states belong to the final moments of the final minute, if the Earth's history is compressed into a day. Yet the body carrying a human mind is built on foundations far older than anything that feels culturally real. Front and back, left and right, a digestive tract running through the body, muscles organized around coordinated movement, sensory concentration toward a head, development from embryo through a tightly regulated sequence of cellular instructions. These are not recent achievements. They are inheritances from deep animal history, and much of their durable logic is clarified during or soon after the Cambrian Revolution. This does not mean the Cambrian settles everything. Far from it. Many crucial innovations come later jaws, bones in their familiar forms, terrestrial plants reshaping the atmosphere and soils, the colonization of land by animals, the amniotic egg, feathers, flowers, placentas, large brains of the kind humans prize, and countless other transformations. But the Cambrian establishes a biosphere in which those later inventions can occur within animal lineages already defined by a new ecological and anatomical world. It is the moment when the planet ceases to be merely hospitable to life and becomes hospitable to a certain style of life that will dominate visible ecosystems for the next 500 million years. The legacy of the explosion is also environmental. Once animals become widespread ecosystem engineers, the Earth's surface systems continue changing under their influence. Burrowing alters sedimentary processes. Reef-building animals and their partners will later reshape coastlines and marine habitats. Grazers, predators, scavengers, and suspension feeders move energy through ecosystems in ways the older microbial world did not. Marine nutrient cycling becomes intertwined with animal bodies, shells, wastes, and behaviors. Much later, terrestrial animals will alter landscapes through trampling, browsing, predation, and eventually construction. The planet had already been transformed by life long before animals appeared. But after the Cambrian, life's visible layer becomes more physically restless and more ecologically stratified than ever before. At the same time, the Cambrian leaves behind an equal and opposite legacy extinction. Most of the specific forms that make the interval so wondrous do not survive intact. The five-eyed proboscis of Opabinia does not persist. The greater anomalocarid predators vanish. Many stem groups disappear after leaving descendants only indirectly or not at all. This matters because it reminds us that the explosion is not a pure triumphal march toward the familiar world. It is an opening of possibilities followed by pruning. Evolution generates abundance, then history removes most of it. Modern animals are the survivors of a much wider field of experiments, and the fossils preserve just enough of that lost abundance to make survival feel less inevitable than it otherwise would. This is perhaps the deepest emotional lesson of the whole story. For 3 billion years, life does not look anything like what human intuition expects from a living planet. Then, when the visible world finally opens, it opens too widely. Strange fronds, quilted seafloor bodies, armored worms, lobopodians, stem arthropods, bizarre predators, soft chordates, and 100 experimental anatomies share the seas. The world becomes recognizable only by passing through a phase of maximum strangeness. The familiar animal biosphere is not the opposite of the alien one. It grows out of it. Scholars still debate many details of the legacy as they do the causes. Exactly how early particular lineages diverge, how rapidly certain ecological transitions spread, how much of the modern phylum-level map truly stabilizes in the Cambrian versus later intervals. These remain active areas of research. The record is rich but still incomplete. Some lineages almost certainly have deeper roots than their first clear fossils show. Some apparently abrupt appearances will continue to soften as new fossils are found. Some creatures now treated as stem members of later groups may yet be reclassified. That uncertainty should not be mistaken for weakness. It is the normal condition of deep time science. The broad pattern is secure even when many branches remain contested. And the broad pattern is extraordinary. Life begins early. It remains mostly microbial for most of Earth's history. Oxygen rises and remakes the planet, yet complexity still stalls. Cells merge and become more powerful. The world freezes and thaws. Multicellularity experiments with quiet bodies. The Ediacaran lays out a strange prelude. Ocean chemistry, nutrients, and ecology converge. Then animals begin transforming one another faster than the planet has ever seen before. The delay is immense. The release is real. That is why the Cambrian turning point remains so compelling. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that history can look static for ages and still be preparing a revolution. What survives from that revolution is not only in museums and fossil beds, it is in living anatomy, in the logic of ecosystems, in the structure of marine food webs, in the existence of active bodies at all. Even the human tendency to ask these questions, to look at rocks and want a narrative, depends on a nervous system and sensory architecture that belong to an animal inheritance rooted in this deep transition. The Cambrian did not produce human beings in any direct or intended sense. Evolution intends nothing, but it established the animal terms under which a creature like this could one day exist. Seen at the wider scale, that may be the most astonishing thing of all. For most of Earth's history, the planet is alive without ever becoming visibly animal in the way now taken for granted. Then, through a convergence of chemistry, cellular innovation, climate, ecological pressure, and contingency, the threshold is crossed. Once crossed, it reshapes everything that comes after. The visible world becomes mobile, sensory, predatory, vulnerable, inventive. The Earth does not stop being microbial. It never will, but it gains another layer of life, one louder in form if not in biochemical power, one that fills the fossil record with bodies, traces, extinctions, and survivors. And among those survivors, much later, is an animal that can stand on dry ground, split open stone, and realize with a kind of vertigo that its own body is an aftershock of an event 500 million years old. The explosion does not merely belong to the past, it is still here, carried forward in every animal movement, every mouth, every eye, every embryo dividing according to ancient rules. The ancient shock still shapes us because in a literal sense, we are one of its lingering consequences. The story ends, if it ends at all, in a kind of reversal. For most of Earth's history, the planet is already alive, yet nothing in that life would look familiar from a distance. No forests darken the continents, no wings cross the sky, no herds move through grasslands, no human hand lifts a fossil from stone and wonders what came before. There is only the long invisible labour of cells, the patient chemistry of oceans, the rise and fall of gases, the freezing and thawing of worlds, and the strange persistence of life working below the level of ordinary sight. The silence is not emptiness, it is preparation. Then, after spans of time so immense they hardly fit the mind, bodies arrive in forms large enough to disturb sediment, to sense, to feed, to move with purpose. The sea begins to fill with consequences. From that point onward, the Earth never entirely returns to stillness. Animal life spreads, transforms, vanishes, returns in altered forms. The planet keeps changing, but now it changes in a world where bodies leave marks everywhere. Shells fall into mud, tracks cross tidal flats, bones collect in riverbeds, eyes evolve to read distance, nerves evolve to answer it. The visible world becomes restless. And yet beneath all that restlessness, the older truth remains. Animals do not replace the ancient world so much as rise from it. The microbial earth is still here, underfoot, within oceans, within rock, within every living body. The first age of life never truly ends. It simply becomes harder to see once larger creatures begin telling the story in outline and motion. The great explosion of animal life feels dramatic because it is visible. But visibility is only the late surface of a much deeper history. That may be why this turning point lingers in the imagination so powerfully. It is not just the moment when life becomes complex, it is the moment when complexity becomes legible. The planet had been building toward it through chemical accidents, cellular bargains, environmental crises, and countless vanished experiments no one will ever fully recover. What looks sudden in stone is made from patience almost beyond measure. So the final image is not really of explosion, but of emergence, a shallow sea under an ancient sky, soft sediment below, strange bodies moving where for ages almost nothing visible had moved, the first eyes opening into water, the first mouths testing a world newly crowded with possibility, and beneath them all, still working as it always had, the older invisible empire of cells, carrying forward the deeper memory of a planet that was alive long before it became familiar,